A wealthy man handed $350 to a struggling mother to buy food for her child. The following day, he found her at the grave of his lost love, who had passed away 23 years earlier. Mark Sterling sat alone at a high-end New York restaurant, surrounded by opulence, yet none of it could alleviate the void within him. He stared through the rain-streaked window, watching the drops fall like the tears he refused to shed, each one pressing on the emptiness in his chest. The world outside was bleak and cold, reflecting the desolation he felt deep inside. For over 2 decades, his life had been shrouded in gloom ever since his wife, Anna, had died unexpectedly. Mark couldn't move past her death. No matter how much success he achieved, no amount of money could fill the chasm left in his heart. Despite building a vast financial empire, his achievements felt hollow. Every business meeting, every extravagant dinner, felt like a futile distraction from the grief he carried daily. Mark absent-mindedly swirled the wine in his glass, staring at the circling liquid. Wealth, fancy parties, grand events, they all felt tasteless to him now, their allure long gone. He sighed, the weight of the years pressing heavily upon him. Despite all his external success, Mark was profoundly lonely. He had no children, at least none he was aware of. Anna had always been hesitant to discuss starting a family, and Mark hadn't pressed the issue. Now, he regretted it deeply. What he wouldn't give for a part of her to still be alive, someone to care for, someone to love. After paying the bill, Mark stood and put on his heavy coat. The lively chatter of the restaurant faded into the background, becoming a distant hum. To him, it was nothing more than white noise. Stepping outside, he was greeted by the relentless rain, cold and unforgiving. The city around him buzzed with energy, but Mark felt only the damp chill and the overwhelming weight of his solitude. As he walked home, he passed by familiar landmarks, places that he and Anna had once frequented together. Each corner, each building, was a reminder of happier times, times when life felt simpler and joy seemed more accessible. Now, all that remained were memories and a gravestone. Like every other day, he would visit Anna's grave tomorrow. Paris would have been the more natural resting place for her, but for reasons Mark never quite understood, she had chosen New York. Perhaps because it symbolized the life they had begun anew together before it was tragically cut short. Walking along the rain-soaked street, Mark noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Beneath a store's awning, a young woman sat, cradling a baby. Her hair was damp, and she looked fragile in the rain. The sight stirred something deep within him. Mark hesitated, unsure of what to do. Over the years, he had donated large sums to charity, but he was not accustomed to interacting with those in need on a personal level. Yet, something about this woman's gentle way of holding her child resonated with him, as though it touched a long-buried part of himself. Moving closer, rain dripping from his coat, Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out $350 in cash, money he had just withdrawn from an ATM. He extended it to the woman. "Take this, get yourself and your baby some food." The woman looked up, surprised, her eyes wide with disbelief before softening into gratitude. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice trembling. "Thank you so much." For the first time in a long while, Mark felt something stir within, a connection to a complete stranger, as if their pain mirrored his own. Without saying more, he nodded and walked away, but as he continued his journey, he couldn't shake the image of the mother and her child. It was as though something dormant had awakened inside him. When Mark finally reached home, he was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. He lay in bed, the steady rhythm of rain against the window the only sound accompanying him. Closing his eyes, the image of the woman and her baby lingered in his mind. Tomorrow, he would visit Anna's grave, just like always. But little did he know that the routine visit was about to alter the course of his life forever. The following morning, Mark followed his usual routine. He woke early, dressed in his usual tailored suit, and prepared for the day ahead. As Mark prepared for his visit to Anna's grave, the overcast sky outside seemed to reflect the somber mood that had been his constant companion for years. The city was still damp from the storm that had drenched it the night before. He grabbed his coat and stepped out. the familiar weight settling onto his chest as he braced himself for yet another solemn journey to the cemetery. As Mark walked, his thoughts drifted back to the young mother and her child. He couldn't quite comprehend why that encounter had lingered in his mind. Over the years, he had seen countless people in need, but something about this particular woman had stayed with him. There had been a look in her eyes, a blend of desperation and something deeper that he couldn't place. It unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. When Mark arrived at the cemetery, he took the well-trodden path to Anna's grave. The area was quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant murmur of the city. He knew this place too well, every visit was the same. He would stand before her headstone, speak to her as if she were still there, then leave feeling just as empty as he had since the day she died. But today felt different. As he approached, something caught his eye. Someone was already at Anna's grave, kneeling in front of the headstone. Mark's heart skipped a beat. It was the same young woman he had encountered the previous night, the one with the baby. She was hunched over, her shoulders shaking as if she were crying. Mark froze in his tracks, his mind racing. What was she doing here? How could she possibly know about Anna? The coincidence was too strange, too unsettling. Mark cautiously approached her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hesitant and unsure. The woman looked up, startled, her eyes red and puffy. She quickly wiped her face with the sleeve of her worn jacket. "I'm sorry," she mumbled, trying to pull herself together. "I didn't mean to intrude." Mark shook his head, still grappling with the oddness of the situation. "You were there yesterday," he said slowly, piecing together the events. "Outside the restaurant. I gave you some money." The woman nodded, glancing down at the baby in her arms, as if that gesture alone explained everything. But for Mark, it didn't. He needed answers. Why was this woman, this stranger, at his wife's grave? "What are you doing here?" Mark asked, his voice now firmer. "How do you know Anna?" The woman hesitated, as if unsure whether to speak. Then, with a deep breath, she looked up at him, her eyes filled with a peculiar blend of pain and resolve. "Anna," she said softly, "was my mother." Mark felt the ground shift beneath him. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he wondered if he had misheard her. He stared at the woman, trying to comprehend the words she had just spoken. "Your mother?" he repeated, his voice barely audible. "That's impossible. Anna never had a child." The woman shook her head, her expression unreadable. "She did," she said quietly. "She had me. She just never told you." Mark felt as though the world had come to a standstill. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what she was saying. This couldn't be true. Anna couldn't have had a child. She would have told him, she wouldn't have kept something like that from him. Or would she? He took a step back, the weight of this revelation crashing down on him. "No," he muttered to himself, more in disbelief than anything else. "That can't be right. There's no way." "I know this is hard to believe," the woman said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "But it's the truth. My name is Grace, and Anna was my mother." Mark's chest tightened as the reality of her words began to sink in. He looked at her, Grace, and then at the baby in her arms. His mind was racing with 1,000 questions, but he didn't know where to start. "Why didn't she tell me?" Mark asked, his voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "Why would she keep this from me?" Grace looked down, her expression sad and conflicted. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never knew her. She died before I ever had the chance to meet her. I was raised by another family." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. For over 2 decades, he had mourned Anna, believing he had known everything there was to know about her. And now, suddenly, he was being confronted with the possibility that she had harbored a secret so deep, so profound, that it changed everything. A secret that had been buried with her for all these years. He took a deep breath, struggling to process it all. "I don't understand," he whispered, his voice full of confusion. Mark shook his head, trying to make sense of it all. Why now? Why are you here? Sophie met his gaze, and for the first time, Mark saw something in her eyes, something familiar. There was a flicker of Anna in them. I found out about her a few months ago, Sophie explained softly. I've been trying to piece together the truth ever since. When I discovered where she was buried, I had to come. Mark stared at her, still struggling to wrap his mind around the revelation. His emotions swirled: confusion, disbelief, anger, but beneath it all, there was a small glimmer of something else: hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, his connection to Anna hadn't been entirely lost. He glanced down at the baby in Sophie's arms, and something shifted inside him. If Sophie was telling the truth, if Anna had really been her mother, then this child was his grandchild. A part of Anna still existed in the world. For the first time in years, Mark felt something other than grief. He didn't know what to say, but he knew one thing: his life had just changed in ways he never could have imagined. He stood there, frozen, staring at Sophie, still trying to absorb what she had just revealed. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around the cemetery, but all Mark could hear was the pounding of his heart. The baby in Sophie's arms stirred, letting out a soft whimper, and that tiny sound seemed to jolt him out of his daze. How? How is this possible? Mark's voice was barely audible. His mind raced with questions. He felt betrayed by the very memory of Anna, as if the woman he had mourned for over 2 decades had been someone he never truly knew. Yet, deep down, he could see that Sophie believed every word she was saying. I know it's a lot to take in, Sophie said, her tone gentle but steady. I've spent my entire life trying to understand too, but I'm telling you the truth. Anna was my mother. Mark's chest tightened, his heart heavy with disbelief. Why didn't she tell me? He muttered, almost to himself. The thought that Anna had kept something so enormous from him was unbearable. How many nights had he lain awake, wondering what their life could have been like if things had gone differently? And now, those what-ifs took on an entirely new and painful significance. Sophie shook her head slowly, her eyes full of empathy. I don't know why she kept it from you, she said softly. I never had the chance to ask her. She passed away when I was still a baby. Mark's thoughts whirled as he tried to make sense of it all. There had to be more to the story. Who raised you, then? If Anna was your mother, why didn't I know about you? Sophie looked uncomfortable, glancing down at the ground as if the weight of the explanation was too much to bear. After she died, I was placed with another family. I grew up not knowing anything about my real parents. I didn't even know where to start looking for you until recently. All I had was her name and a few bits of information I could piece together. Mark's heart ached. He had lived his life believing he knew everything there was to know about Anna, only to discover that there were entire chapters of her life he had never even glimpsed. So, you came here looking for answers? Mark asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Sophie nodded. Yes, I wanted to understand who she was. I wanted to know why she kept me a secret. And when I found out where she was buried, I knew I had to come. Mark's gaze drifted to Anna's headstone, her name carved into the cold, unyielding stone. For so long, he had visited this grave, speaking to her, trying to make peace with her absence. But now, standing here with Sophie and the baby, that fragile peace felt shattered. Everything felt different: his memories, his grief, his understanding of who Anna had been. He took a deep breath, his mind desperately searching for something solid to hold onto in the midst of this emotional storm. And this baby, Mark said, his voice cracking slightly as he gestured toward the child in Sophie's arms, is this my grandchild? Sophie looked down at the baby, a soft smile breaking through the tension on her face. Yes, she said quietly. His name is Daniel. Mark stared at the baby, so small and delicate, and felt his heart swell with a mix of shock, disbelief, and something else: hope. Daniel was a connection to Anna, a living link to the life they could have had together, a life that had been kept from him, but that he now had the chance to embrace. As Mark stood there, the weight of it all threatened to overwhelm him. For years, he had been stuck in the past, mourning Anna and the life they'd lost. But now, as he looked at Sophie and Daniel, he realized that life hadn't completely disappeared, it had continued on, quietly, without him. And now, it was here, right in front of him. He was being given a chance to reclaim a part of his past, but the betrayal still hung heavily over him. How could Anna have kept this secret from him? How could she have made such a life-altering decision without even telling him she was pregnant? I don't understand, Mark finally said, his voice hoarse. Why would she hide you from me? Why would she go through this alone? Sophie's face softened, though sadness lingered in her eyes. I don't know all the details, but I can imagine. Maybe she thought you wouldn't want the responsibility of a child. Or maybe she thought you were too focused on your work to be a father. I don't know, Mark. I wish I did. Mark shook his head, the weight of her words pressing down on him. But she should have given me a choice. She should have let me decide. Sophie nodded. Maybe she was scared. Maybe she didn't know how to tell you. Or maybe she thought she was protecting you. The idea that Anna might have kept Sophie a secret out of a misguided attempt to protect him left Mark conflicted. He had always believed that Anna trusted him, that they were partners in everything. Now, he was beginning to realize there were parts of her life he had never truly known. Mark's eyes met Sophie's again, and for the first time, he felt a strange sense of connection, not just to her, but to the life he had never known existed, to the possibilities that had been lost but could now be reclaimed. What do you want from me? Mark asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. Sophie hesitated, then looked him in the eye. I don't want anything from you. I just want to know where I came from. And I think you deserve to know the truth about your wife. Mark nodded slowly, her words sinking in. The truth about Anna, the truth he had spent so many years without. He didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear, his life had just changed in ways he could never have imagined. There was no going back to the way things had been. And maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a bad thing. Mark stood in stunned silence, unable to fully grasp the enormity of what Sophie had just revealed. Anna had a daughter, his daughter, a life he had never known, hidden from him all these years. The betrayal hurt, but it was mixed with confusion, regret, and something he hadn't expected, responsibility. Sophie and the baby in her arms were living proof of a past he hadn't been allowed to be part of, but they were here now, standing in front of him. I still don't understand, Mark finally said, his voice quieter now, the sharp edge of anger softening into something more vulnerable. Anna never told me she was pregnant. How could she have kept this from me? Sophie's eyes flickered with empathy. I don't know why she made that choice. I've asked myself the same question over and over again, but I never got any answers. All I know is that she made that decision, and it's affected both of us. Mark took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling. Anna had always been private, even with him. They had argued about it often, about how much she kept to herself. But this was a secret on a level he couldn't have imagined. Do you know anything about her? About why she did it? Mark asked, his voice tentative, almost afraid of the answer. Sophie sighed, looking down at the baby in her arms. I wish I knew more. The people who raised me didn't know much about her either. I've spent the last few months trying to piece things together. But the truth is, there are a lot of gaps. Still, I know one thing for sure, she loved you. Mark's eyes widened in surprise. She told you that? No, Sophie replied softly, shaking her head. But I've seen it in everything I've learned about her. The way she spoke about you to people, the way she lived her life, it was always clear that you were important to her. Even if she kept you in the dark about some things. Mark clenched his jaw, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. For years, he had struggled to make peace with Anna's death. To come to terms with the fact that they would never have the future they had dreamed of. Now, this revelation had reopened old wounds he thought had healed. He wasn't just mourning the loss of his wife anymore, he was mourning the life he had never known, the daughter he had never had the chance to raise. And you, Mark asked, his voice strained. Why now? Why did you decide to find me? Sophie met his gaze steadily, her expression resolute. Calmness in Sophie's voice surprised him. "I didn't find out Emily was my mother until a few months ago," she said softly. "Before that, all I had was a name and a vague story about my adoption. When I learned the truth, I knew I had to come here to find out more about who I am and where I came from. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I would discover." Mark felt his breath catch in his throat. He could see the weight Sophie carried in her eyes, the burden of a past she hadn't been able to access, a burden that had now, in some way, become his as well. He glanced at the baby in her arms, now fast asleep, the gentle rise and fall of his small chest almost surreal to Mark. This child, his grandson, was a living link to Anna, a continuation of the life they had shared, even if it had been hidden from him for all these years. "Daniel," Sophie said, breaking his thoughts, as if sensing what he was thinking. "His name is Daniel." Mark's gaze softened as he looked at the baby again. "Daniel," he repeated quietly. The name felt unfamiliar on his lips, but grounding in a way he hadn't anticipated. For so long, he had felt adrift, going through life without any real purpose. But now, standing there with Sophie and Daniel, something inside him was beginning to shift. "I didn't come here to ask for anything," Sophie continued, drawing Mark's attention back. "I'm not expecting you to play a role in my life or Daniel's. I just needed to know the truth. I needed to understand where I came from, and now I do." Mark stared at her, feeling a surge of emotion well up inside him. He didn't know what Sophie wanted from him, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't turn his back on her or on Daniel. "You're my daughter," Mark said, the words heavy in his mouth, foreign and full of meaning. He had never imagined saying such a thing, least of all in a cemetery, standing in front of Anna's grave. "And that makes Daniel my grandson." Sophie looked at him cautiously, unsure of where he was going with this. "I've spent my whole life building something," Mark continued, his voice quiet but resolute. "But none of it ever mattered. Not really. Not after Anna died. I didn't have anything left. But now, I'm realizing maybe I still have a chance. A chance to be something more than just a businessman." Sophie blinked, a mix of surprise and skepticism crossing her face. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you'll let me, I want to be part of your life," Mark said, his voice breaking slightly. "I've missed so much already, but I don't want to miss anymore." Sophie stared at him, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Mark could see the hesitation in her eyes, the fear of letting someone into her life she had never known. But there was also a flicker of hope, faint but unmistakable. The hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something new. "I don't know if it'll be easy," Sophie said finally, her voice soft. "There's a lot we don't know about each other." Mark nodded. "I know. But I'm willing to try, if you are." Sophie glanced down at Daniel, then back at Mark. "Okay," she said quietly. "We can try." For the first time in years, Mark felt a small spark of warmth in his chest. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give him hope that maybe, despite all the loss and pain, there was still something left for him to hold on to. As Mark walked away from the cemetery that day, his mind was a swirling storm of emotions. The revelation that Anna had kept something so monumental from him gnawed at him, and the thought of Sophie and Daniel lingered in his thoughts. His life, once so controlled and predictable, now felt completely upended in the span of a few hours. The city bustled with its usual energy, but Mark moved through it as if on autopilot. The encounter with Sophie had shaken him to his core, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew about his past. As much as he wanted to be angry, to feel betrayed by Anna, he couldn't ignore the strange sense of responsibility he now felt. Sophie was his daughter, and Daniel was his grandson. He couldn't walk away from that. Back at his apartment, the rain had started again, tapping softly against the windows. Mark stood in the dim light of the room, staring out at the city. His thoughts returned to Anna, her laughter, the way she used to look at him, the dreams they had shared before everything had fallen apart. For years, he had tried to keep her memory alive through his grief, trying to preserve her in some small way. But now, with Sophie's revelation, Mark began to wonder if he had ever really known Anna at all. Why had she hidden this from him? What had she been thinking in those final months of her life? Could talk without distractions. Richard arrived early, nervous anticipation bubbling inside him. The cafe was cozy, with soft lighting and the comforting smell of freshly brewed coffee. He sat at a corner table, glancing at the door every few seconds, waiting for Sophie to arrive. As he waited, his mind replayed the events of the last few days. Finding out about Sophie, the journal entry, the revelation that Anna had hidden so much from him, not out of betrayal but out of fear. It all still felt surreal. The photo of them together, their smiles, their happiness, felt like a distant memory now. He couldn't reconcile that Anna with the one who had kept such a monumental secret. But he also couldn't deny the truth he had read in her journal. She had been scared, trying to protect him, thinking she was doing what was best. The bell above the cafe door jingled, snapping him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see Sophie walk in, her expression unreadable. She spotted him and made her way over, her steps hesitant but determined. As she sat down across from him, the air between them felt heavy with unspoken words. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Richard could see the resemblance to Anna more clearly now, the same eyes, the same quiet strength. He cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "Sophie," he began, his voice low but steady, "thank you for coming." Sophie nodded, her expression softening slightly. "I wasn't sure if you would call," she admitted. "I had to," Richard replied, his eyes meeting hers. "After everything. I couldn't just walk away." Sophie looked down at the table, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her coffee cup. "It's a lot to take in," she said softly. "For both of us." Richard nodded in agreement. "It is. But I've been thinking a lot, and I want you to know. I don't want to lose more time. I know we can't change the past, but I want to be part of your life, and Daniel's too. If you'll let me." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for sincerity. "I've spent my whole life wondering who my father was," she said quietly. "And now that I know, it's strange. I didn't know what to expect when I found you." Richard's chest tightened. He could feel the weight of all the years they had missed, all the moments they could never get back. "I don't know what to expect either," he admitted. "But I want to try. I don't want to miss any more of your life, or Daniel's. I'm ready to be here now, if you'll have me." For a long moment, Sophie didn't speak. She studied him, as if trying to decide whether to trust him. But then she gave a small nod. "Okay," she said softly. "We can try." Richard exhaled, relief washing over him. It wasn't an instant fix, and he knew the road ahead would be difficult. Full of unanswered questions and emotional wounds that would take time to heal. But this was a start. And after everything that had happened, it was enough. They spent the next hour talking about her childhood, about Daniel, about the gaps in their lives they were just beginning to fill. It was awkward at times, and neither of them had all the answers. But there was a tentative sense of hope growing between them, a fragile bond slowly forming. As they stood to leave, Richard hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "Sophie. Thank you. For giving me this chance." Sophie smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you for reaching out." They walked out of the cafe together, the city bustling around them. For the first time in years, Richard felt something other than the emptiness that had defined his life since Anna's death. It wasn't a full healing, but it was the beginning of something new, a chance to reclaim a part of his life that he had thought was lost forever. As they parted ways, Richard couldn't help but glance up at the sky. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were starting to break, revealing small patches of blue. For the first time in a long time, he felt the faint stirrings of hope. And maybe, just maybe, he could build something meaningful with Sophie and Daniel, something that could heal the wounds of the past. Would make everything clearer, make the pain less somehow. But it's just complicated, isn't it? Richard nodded, understanding the weight of her words. It is complicated and painful for all of us. He hesitated, glancing down at Daniel, who had started to fuss lightly in Sophie's arms. But now we have the chance to try and make sense of it, together. Sophie looked down at her son, gently rocking him as he settled back into a quiet state. I spent so long feeling like there was something wrong with me, she admitted softly, her eyes focused on Daniel. That I wasn't wanted, that I was a mistake. But hearing that she was trying to protect both of us. I don't know, it doesn't take away the hurt, but it helps. Richard swallowed hard, emotions tightening his throat. I've spent years asking myself what I could have done differently, how I could have been there for Emily in those last months. But now, knowing this, I wish she would have let me in. I wish we could have faced it together. Sophie looked up at him, her gaze steady but softer now. I don't know what she was going through, but maybe she thought she was saving you from something you weren't ready for. Maybe she was trying to protect you from the responsibility of raising a child when your life was already full of other pressures. Richard rubbed a hand over his face, the reality of it all pressing down on him. But I would have wanted to be there, he said quietly. For her, for you. I would have wanted to be part of your life from the start. Sophie nodded, her expression a mixture of sadness and understanding. I know. And I'm starting to believe that. I think I've held on to the idea that she didn't want me for so long, it's hard to let go of it. But maybe now. Maybe we can start from here. Richard smiled faintly, a sense of hope threading through the conversation, however fragile. That's all I want, he said. To start from here, to try and build something together. I don't know how this is going to go, or how we'll figure everything out, but I want to try. I want to be part of your life, and Daniel's. Sophie glanced at Daniel, then back at Richard, her expression softening further. I want that too, she said, her voice almost a whisper. I want to try. The two of them sat there for a moment in silence, the weight of their shared past lingering, but the future beginning to feel a little lighter. It wouldn't be easy, they both knew that, but they had taken the first step. Thank you, Richard said after a while, his voice thick with emotion. For giving me this chance. Sophie smiled, a small but genuine one. Thank you for reaching out, she replied. I wasn't sure if you would. Richard nodded, glancing down at the journal still resting on the table between them. I'm glad I did. And I'm glad we're here. They stood to leave, the tension between them easing into something more familiar, more hopeful. As they stepped outside, the city moved around them, bustling and vibrant, but for the first time in a long time, Richard felt a sense of clarity. A sense of purpose. The rain had cleared, and the sky was beginning to show hints of blue. As they walked down the street together, the past didn't feel so heavy anymore. It would always be there, but now, they had the opportunity to create something new. And for the first time in years, Richard felt like he had something to look forward to, a future that, despite its complications, held the promise of healing and connection. Maybe, just maybe, he could finally move forward. Fallen asleep in her arms, his tiny face peaceful and unaware of the heavy emotions swirling around him. She let out a soft sigh and nodded again, this time with a little more resolve. I think that's all we can do, she said quietly. One step at a time. Richard smiled faintly, feeling a warmth in his chest that had been absent for so long. That's all I'm asking for. Sophie looked at him, the guardedness still present, but it was starting to fade. It won't be easy. There's a lot we still don't know about each other. I know, Richard replied, his voice gentle. But we'll figure it out together. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. For the first time since they had met, Sophie smiled, a small, tentative smile, but it was real. Okay, she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of uncertainty and hope. They sat there for a moment longer in comfortable silence, the enormity of their situation still looming, but no longer feeling quite so impossible. It wasn't closure, not entirely, but it was a beginning. As Sophie stood to leave, Daniel still cradled in her arms, Richard rose too, not wanting the moment to end but knowing they both needed time. "Thank you, Sophie," he said, his voice full of sincerity, "for giving me this chance." Sophie glanced at him, her expression softening. "Thank you for wanting it," she replied quietly. "We'll talk soon." Richard nodded as she turned to leave, watching her walk out of the cafe and disappear into the bustling city. For the first time in years, he didn't feel trapped in the past. There was still so much to work through, but he had hope for the future, for a relationship with Sophie and Daniel. As Richard stepped outside, the sun had begun to peek through the clouds, casting a gentle glow on the city streets. He took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in years. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a new chapter. And for the first time, he was ready to move forward. Couldn't shake the lingering questions about why Emily had kept such a significant secret from him. But as much as those thoughts haunted him, he knew he had to focus on the present. On the chance he had been given to build something new with Sophie and Daniel. In the days following their meeting, Richard and Sophie continued to navigate this delicate new relationship. Their conversations were careful, tentative, like two people feeling their way through unfamiliar territory. But there was progress, slow but steady. Each time they met, Richard noticed small shifts, Sophie's guardedness slowly beginning to fade, Daniel growing more comfortable around him. Richard made an effort to spend time with them, taking small steps to be a part of their lives. He offered to help Sophie with little things, picking up groceries or watching Daniel for a few hours when she needed a break. It wasn't much, but it was his way of showing her that he was committed, that he wanted to be there not just in words, but in actions. And Sophie, for her part, started to let him in. She shared more about her childhood, her struggles, and the gaps in her life where she had wondered about her real family. It was hard for her to talk about, and Richard could see the pain in her eyes as she recounted her feelings of abandonment, of wondering why her mother had left her. But each time she opened up, their bond strengthened just a little bit more. One afternoon, as they sat in a park watching Daniel play on the grass, Sophie turned to Richard with a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Do you ever wonder why she did it? Why she didn't tell you?" She asked softly, her voice filled with a mix of curiosity and sadness. Richard paused, taking a deep breath as he considered his answer. "Every day," he admitted. "I've gone over it again and again in my head, trying to understand her reasons. I think she was scared of how I'd react, scared of how it would change our lives. Maybe she thought she was protecting both of us." Sophie nodded, her gaze thoughtful as she looked out at Daniel. "I guess I'll never really know why she made the choices she did. But hearing you say that, it helps. It makes me feel like maybe it wasn't about me being unwanted." Richard reached out, placing a hand gently on her arm. "You were never unwanted, Sophie. Not by me, not by her. I'm sure of that." She looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you." As they sat there in the park, watching Daniel toddle around, Richard realized that the heavy weight of the past wasn't gone. But it was becoming easier to carry. The pain of Emily's choices and the years he had missed with Sophie and Daniel would never fully disappear. But now, there was something else, a fragile hope for the future, a chance to build something meaningful out of the fragments of what had been lost. In that moment, Richard knew that while the past had shaped them, it didn't have to define them. They had the opportunity to write a new story, and for the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to believe that perhaps the future could hold happiness, love, and family once again. About where we go from here. Richard's heart tightened as he listened, watching the emotions flicker across Sophie's face. Richard's heart tightened as he listened, watching the emotions flicker across Sophie's face. She was clearly grappling with something big, and he wasn't sure what to expect. "I've spent so long being angry," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Angry at my mom for leaving me, for not telling me the truth. Angry at you for not being there, even though I know now that you didn't know. And I don't want to carry that anger anymore. But there's more I need to share with you." Richard's mind raced, unsure where this was going. "What is it?" he asked gently, his voice filled with concern. Sophie took a deep breath, her hands still fidgeting. When I started looking into my past, trying to find out more about my mom, I also looked into her life before she met you. And I found something. Something I didn't expect. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, his mind already spinning with possibilities. What did you find? Sophie hesitated, clearly struggling with how to say it. I found out that before she met you, she had another relationship. And I think I have a half-sibling. A brother. Richard's breath caught in his throat. A brother? He echoed, his mind reeling. He had never imagined this possibility. Did she know about him? Sophie nodded slowly. I think she did. But she never told anyone, not even the family that raised me. I don't know much about him yet, just that he was born before she met you and was given up for adoption too. Richard sat back, the weight of this new revelation settling on him. He had spent years believing he had known everything there was to know about Emily, only to find out that she had kept not just Sophie, but now potentially another child, from him. It was almost too much to process. I'm sorry to drop this on you, Sophie said, her voice shaking slightly. I'd been holding on to it for a while, trying to figure out what to do with it. But I thought you deserved to know. Richard shook his head, still trying to absorb what he had just heard. I'm glad you told me, he said softly. I don't know what to say. I don't either, Sophie admitted, her eyes filling with tears. I don't even know if I should try to find him or if he even wants to be found. But I couldn't keep this from you. Richard reached out, placing a comforting hand on Sophie's arm. We'll figure it out together, he said, his voice firm but gentle. Whatever this means for us, for you and Daniel, we'll face it together. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. You really mean that? I do, Richard said without hesitation. I've already missed too much. I'm not going to miss anything else, not if I can help it. Sophie nodded, wiping away a tear. Okay, she whispered. We'll figure it out. They sat there in silence for a moment, the enormity of the situation hanging between them. But in that silence, there was also a sense of unity, a feeling that despite all the secrets and the pain of the past, they weren't facing this alone. As they stood to leave, Richard glanced down at Daniel, still bundled up in his stroller, blissfully unaware of the complexities of the world around him. For Richard, seeing Daniel was a reminder of the future they still had in front of them, a future that, while uncertain, held the potential for healing and connection. As they parted ways, Richard couldn't help but feel a strange mixture of emotions, shock, confusion, but also hope. He had spent years believing his life had ended with Emily's death, but now he realized that perhaps it was only just beginning again, in ways he never could have imagined. Richard felt his heart clench painfully as he stared at the letter, the weight of Emily's words crushing him. She had been pregnant, and she had kept it from him because of something he had said. The realization was like a punch to the gut. He had never imagined that his words, perhaps said offhandedly, could have led to this, to her keeping such a monumental secret. I don't understand, Richard said, his voice barely a whisper, his hands trembling as he placed the letter down on the bench. She thought I didn't want children? That I didn't want you? Sophie finally turned to look at him, her expression full of sadness and understanding. I don't think it was that simple, she said softly. Maybe she thought she was protecting you because she was afraid of how things might change. She probably believed she was doing what was best for both of you. Richard's mind raced, flashing back to countless conversations they had had over the years. He remembered vaguely saying once that he wasn't sure about having kids, that his career was demanding and complicated. But it had never been a firm decision, and certainly not something he would have used to justify losing out on something so profound. I didn't know, Richard murmured, shaking his head. I didn't mean it like that. I would have wanted to know. I would have wanted to be there for you. For her. Sophie nodded, but the pain in her eyes was unmistakable. "I've wondered my whole life why she didn't tell you. I grew up thinking maybe she didn't want me, or maybe she thought you wouldn't. But reading that letter, I realized it wasn't about not wanting me, it was about fear. She was scared of what it would mean for both of you." Richard felt a wave of guilt wash over him. How could he have been so blind? How could he not have seen how fragile Emily had felt, how much she had been carrying on her own? "She should have told me," he whispered, his voice raw. "I would have wanted to be part of your life, Sophie. I never meant for her to feel like I didn't want you." Sophie's eyes filled with unshed tears, but she nodded in understanding. "I know that now. I think she was just afraid that telling you would change everything. Maybe she didn't trust herself to handle it, or maybe she thought you didn't need the complication. I'll never fully understand her reasons, but reading that letter has helped me see things differently." Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped together tightly as if trying to hold himself together. "I would have loved you," he said quietly, his voice full of regret. "I would have loved you and been there for both of you, if only she had told me." Sophie wiped a tear away, her voice breaking slightly as she spoke. "I know. And I'm sorry, too. For a long time, I was angry at both of you. But now I realize it was more complicated than I thought. I don't want to hold on to that anger anymore. I just want to move forward, if we can." Richard looked at her, his chest tight with emotion. "We can," he said firmly. "We can try. I don't know how we'll make sense of all this, but I want to be part of your life. I've already lost so much time. I don't want to lose any more." Sophie gave him a small, tentative smile. "I want that too." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past still heavy but beginning to lift. Richard knew that this wouldn't be easy, that the pain of what had been lost would always linger. But now, for the first time, there was hope. There was a chance to rebuild, to create something new out of the broken pieces of the past. "I'm sorry for everything," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "For not being there. For not knowing. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." Sophie nodded, her tears finally spilling over, but her smile growing a little wider. "Thank you," she whispered. "For wanting to be here." They sat for a little while longer. The sound of the lake gently lapping against the shore as they both processed the enormity of what had just been revealed. It wasn't the closure Richard had hoped for, but it was a start. A fragile, tentative start toward healing. And for now, that was enough. And caught up in the whirlwind of building their careers and exploring the world. He might have mentioned something about how having children could complicate their fast-paced lives, but it was never meant as a firm declaration. It was just a thought, something he assumed they would revisit when the time was right. But Emily, it seemed, had held on to those words, letting them shape her decision in ways Richard never could have anticipated. Sitting there, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He felt regret so deep it was almost paralyzing. How could a passing comment, something he barely remembered, have had such an impact? How could he not have seen what Emily was feeling, the fear she carried, the loneliness she must have felt making that decision on her own? His thoughts turned to Sophie, the daughter he never knew, the life he had missed. And Daniel, his grandson, whose very existence had been hidden from him by the same fear that had kept Sophie from him all these years. The enormity of what he had lost, of the years that had slipped away, was overwhelming. But alongside the grief and regret, there was also a glimmer of hope. Sophie had given him a chance to be part of her life, to be there for Daniel. It was a chance he hadn't expected, and one he wasn't about to waste. He knew he couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the decisions Emily had made, or the words he had said. But he could make different choices now. He could step up and be the father and grandfather he had never had the opportunity to be. Richard took a deep breath, setting the journal and the letter aside. The pain of the past would always be with him, but he couldn't live there anymore. Emily's decisions, her fear, it had shaped their lives in ways he couldn't change, but he didn't have to let it define the future. He thought about his next steps, how he could reach out to Sophie more, how he could start building that relationship piece by piece. He didn't want to push too hard, but he also didn't want to let too much time pass, not after everything they had already lost. The following morning, he called Sophie. His heart raced as the phone rang, each second feeling like an eternity. When she finally answered, her voice soft but steady, Richard felt a surge of relief. "Hey," he said, his voice a bit shaky. "I was thinking, would you and Daniel like to come over for dinner this weekend? I'd really like to spend some time with you both." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before Sophie responded. "That sounds nice," she said quietly. "We'd like that." Richard smiled, feeling that small spark of hope grow a little brighter. "Great. I'll make something special." They chatted for a few more moments, making plans, and when they hung up, Richard felt lighter. It wasn't a solution to everything, and it wouldn't erase the years they had lost. But it was a step forward. A chance to start building the future, together. As the weekend approached, Richard found himself thinking less about the letter and more about the new memories he could create with Sophie and Daniel. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew they had a lot to work through, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they had a future worth fighting for. That evening, as he prepared for their visit, Richard stood in his kitchen, the smell of a roast filling the air, and for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't in a long time: contentment. It wasn't complete, and it wasn't perfect, but it was enough. When Sophie and Daniel arrived, the evening was filled with quiet conversation, soft laughter, and a sense of tentative peace. Daniel played happily, unaware of the complicated history surrounding him, and Sophie smiled more than Richard had ever seen her smile before. As the night drew to a close, Richard walked them to the door, the weight of the past still lingering, but no longer suffocating. They had started to carve out something new, something that held the promise of healing and connection. And for the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could build something meaningful out of the broken pieces of what had been lost. As he watched them leave, Richard stood in the doorway, the cool night air brushing against his skin, and he smiled. It wasn't the life he had once imagined, but it was a life. And that was enough. "Nothing too serious," Sophie replied, smiling softly as she looked down at Daniel. "Just a routine checkup." Richard crouched down further, reaching out a hand cautiously. Daniel, with his wide eyes peeking out from under his tiny hat, stared curiously at Richard before offering a little gurgle in response. Richard felt an unexpected warmth spread through him. This was his grandson, his flesh and blood. The reality of it all was slowly beginning to sink in, and in that moment, the weight of the past, the secrets, and the pain didn't seem quite as heavy. "He's a strong little guy," Richard said, his voice filled with emotion he hadn't expected to feel so intensely. He stood back up, looking at Sophie. "Thank you for inviting me. It means a lot." Sophie nodded, her expression soft but guarded. "I figured it'd be good for us to spend more time together," she said, glancing at Daniel before meeting Richard's eyes. "I don't want to rush things, but I want to give this a chance." Richard's heart swelled with hope. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but Sophie was giving him an opening, a chance to be present, to make up for lost time. Even if it would take time to truly bridge the gap between them. "I want that too," Richard said, his voice steady but emotional. "Whatever you need, however long it takes. I'm here." They walked into the pediatrician's office together, a quiet but significant step towards something new. As they sat in the waiting room, the silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but rather filled with the weight of possibility. Sophie occasionally glanced at Richard, as if trying to gauge how he was handling this new role, while Richard focused on Daniel, feeling a strange yet fulfilling sense of purpose. As the appointment went on and the doctor gave Daniel a clean bill of health, Richard found himself immersed in the small but important details of his grandson's life, his growth, his milestones. The little things that Sophie had experienced on her own up until now. Richard realized just how much he had missed, but also how much there still was to be a part of. Outside the office, as they stood by the door once again, Sophie turned to Richard with a tentative smile. "Thanks for coming today. It meant a lot. To both of us." Richard nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "I'm glad I could be here. I want to be here for both of you. For as long as you'll have me." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her eyes softening. "We'll take it one day at a time." And that was enough for Richard. One day at a time was all he could ask for. As they said their goodbyes and went their separate ways, Richard walked away feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of belonging. Of hope. It wasn't perfect, and there was still much to navigate, but for the first time in years, Richard felt like he had a future to look forward to. As he headed home, his mind filled with thoughts of Sophie and Daniel, Richard knew that the past could never be undone. The lost years were gone, but there was still time to build something new, a family, a connection, and a future that, though complicated, was worth fighting for. Willing to take this one step at a time, no rush, no unrealistic expectations, just an honest attempt at building something real. The shared understanding between them felt like a fragile yet vital thread, one they both knew could easily break if handled carelessly. As they walked together, Sophie pushed Daniel's stroller while Richard walked beside them, the cool autumn breeze brushing against their faces. There was a quiet sense of peace, though underneath, Richard could still feel the weight of all that had been unsaid, the years they had lost. But for now, he allowed himself to focus on what they had gained, a chance. They stopped at a small cafe nearby, a simple but cozy place with warm light streaming from the windows. It felt like the perfect spot to continue the conversation, one that didn't need to be forced but seemed to flow naturally. Richard held the door open as Sophie pushed Daniel inside, settling at a corner table where they could speak quietly. Over coffee, they talked about everyday things, Daniel's sleep schedule, the little milestones he was reaching, what he liked and didn't like. Richard listened intently, absorbing every detail, every small moment he had missed. It hurt, but it also gave him hope. He wasn't too late. He still had time to be part of this, to be there for Sophie and Daniel in ways that mattered. At one point, Sophie looked at Richard, her expression soft but thoughtful. "You know, I didn't think this would feel as comfortable as it does," she admitted quietly. "I've spent so long feeling like something was missing, but now, I think maybe it doesn't have to stay that way." Richard smiled, feeling that lump in his throat again. "I've missed a lot," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want to miss anything else. Whatever it takes, Sophie, I'm here. For you, and for Daniel." Sophie gave him a small, tentative smile. "I think we'll figure it out. Together." They sat in the cafe for a while longer, the atmosphere warm and calm, the future slowly unfolding before them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Richard felt a sense of belonging, a sense of family that had been absent for too long. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. As they left the cafe and said their goodbyes, Richard watched Sophie and Daniel walk away, feeling lighter than he had in years. The path ahead wasn't easy, but for the first time, he believed it was one worth walking. One step at a time, they were moving forward toward healing, toward connection, and toward a future they could build together. Understand more about her life, about the choices she made. "Anne, I found something." Sophie's voice trailed off, and Richard could sense the weight of what she was about to say. He put his coffee down, his eyes locked on hers. "What did you find?" he asked gently, bracing himself for whatever truth was about to surface. Sophie hesitated for a moment, as if gathering her thoughts. "I found letters. Old ones, tucked away in some boxes of Mom's things. They were from someone. A man she knew before you. I think she might have had another relationship before you met." Richard felt his heart skip a beat. He had suspected there were parts of Emily's life he didn't know, but this was a revelation he hadn't anticipated. "A relationship?" he echoed, trying to keep his voice steady. "Do you know who he was?" Sophie nodded, her expression serious. "His name was David. From what I can tell, they were involved for a while, but something happened. The letters don't say exactly, but it seems like they drifted apart before she met you. I'm not sure if she ever talked about him." Richard shook his head slowly, processing this new piece of the puzzle. "No, she never mentioned anyone before me." He felt a mix of emotions: surprise, sadness, and a strange sense of curiosity. Did the letters say anything else? Anything about why they ended things? Sophie shrugged, her face reflecting the uncertainty she felt. "Not really. Just that it seemed like they were close, but then something changed. I guess she moved on, met you, and built a new life." Richard sat back, absorbing the information. He wasn't angry or upset, but the revelation added another layer to the already complicated feelings he had about Emily and their past. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "I never imagined. But I guess we all have parts of our past we don't share." Sophie nodded. "Yeah, I guess so. I just thought you should know. I don't think it changes anything between us or how I feel about her. It's just another part of the story." Richard reached out and gently touched Sophie's arm. "Thank you for telling me. I'm glad you shared this with me. Whatever her past was, it doesn't change the fact that we're here now, trying to move forward together." Sophie gave a small smile, her eyes softening. "I think Mom loved you, Dad. Whatever happened before, I think you were the person she chose. That's why it was so hard for her to tell you about me." Richard swallowed hard at the word dad, a wave of emotion crashing over him. It was the first time Sophie had called him that, and it meant more than he could express. "I hope so," he said quietly. "I really hope so." They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation settling around them. But there was also a sense of relief, a shared understanding that, despite the complicated past, they were building something new. As Daniel let out a soft coo, both Richard and Sophie looked at him, smiling at the little boy who had become the bridge between their fractured past and their hopeful future. "I don't know what the future holds for us," Sophie said softly, her eyes on Daniel, "but I think we're on the right path." Richard nodded, his heart full. "We are. And whatever comes next, we'll face it together." In that moment, as the afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the room, Richard felt a deep sense of peace. There was still so much to unpack, so many things to work through, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was right where he belonged, with his daughter and his grandson, ready to face whatever the future held, one step at a time. "To hide this from you, but I felt like you needed to know," Sophie said softly, her voice steady but laced with concern. "I found it a few days ago while I was going through Mom's things. I don't know what to make of it, but it felt important." Richard sat back, the letter still clutched in his trembling hands. The revelation hit him like a tidal wave, and for a moment, he felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. James Porter, his old friend, someone he had trusted and cared for in his youth, had been involved with Emily, the woman Richard had loved deeply. The woman he thought he knew completely. The realization was too much to process all at once. I had no idea," Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. He shook his head, trying to make sense of the flood of emotions overwhelming him: betrayal, confusion, heartbreak. "How could I not have known?" Sophie's expression softened, and she reached out to place a comforting hand on his arm. "I don't think it was about keeping it from you to hurt you," she said gently. "I think maybe she was trying to protect you. Maybe it was something from her past that she thought was over, something that didn't matter anymore once she chose to be with you." Richard swallowed hard, the weight of Sophie's words settling on him. His mind raced back to his memories of James. They had been close once, inseparable in their youth. But life had taken them in different directions, and eventually, they had lost touch. Never in his wildest dreams had he imagined that James and Emily had shared something, a connection that Emily had never mentioned. He looked back at the letter, reading it again, trying to piece together the truth. James hadn't written it to stir up trouble. In fact, it seemed like he had never intended to send it at all. The letter spoke of regret, of lost opportunities, and of a choice that Emily had made a choice to be with Richard. Despite whatever had existed between her and James. "I'm so sorry," Sophie said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't know how to tell you, and I wasn't sure if I should, but I couldn't keep it from you. I thought you deserved to know." Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "Thank you for telling me," he managed to say, though his voice was hoarse. "I'm glad you did. I don't know how to feel right now." Sophie nodded, understanding in her eyes. "I didn't know how I felt when I first read it either. It's a lot to take in." Richard sat in silence for a few moments, staring down at the letter, trying to reconcile this new piece of Emily's past with the woman he had loved. He had always believed that their relationship had been built on trust and honesty. And now he realized that there were parts of her life, significant parts, that she had kept hidden. "I wish he had told me," Richard said quietly, his voice filled with regret. "Even if it was difficult, even if it was something from her past, I wish she had trusted me enough to tell me the truth." Sophie nodded, her expression filled with empathy. "I understand. But maybe she was scared. Maybe she thought telling you would change things between you. And in the end, she chose you, Dad. That's what matters, right?" Richard blinked, the word dad hitting him once again with a rush of emotion. Sophie had called him that before, but each time she did, it felt like a step toward healing, toward the relationship he had longed for. "Yeah," Richard said softly, his voice breaking slightly. "She chose me." For all the pain and confusion swirling in his mind, that simple truth offered some comfort. Emily had chosen him, had built a life with him, even if there were parts of her past that she had kept to herself. And now, he had Sophie and Daniel, his family, a chance to rebuild what had been fractured. Sophie squeezed his arm gently, her eyes filled with understanding. "We'll figure this out together. We're all still learning how to make sense of the past, but we can move forward, one step at a time." Richard smiled faintly, the warmth of her words sinking in. "One step at a time," he echoed, nodding. "We'll get through this." As they sat in the quiet of Sophie's apartment, the weight of the revelation slowly began to lift. There was still pain, still unanswered questions, but there was also hope, a fragile but growing sense that, despite everything, they could find a way forward. And in that moment, Richard knew that whatever had happened between Emily and James, it didn't change the future he wanted to build with Sophie and Daniel. He was ready to face it all, past and present, together with them. Before James responded, surprise evident in his voice. "Richard, I didn't expect to hear from you. It's been a long time." Richard swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. The conversation he had dreaded for days was now unfolding, and he wasn't sure how to begin. The anger and confusion swirling inside him felt overwhelming, but he knew he needed to keep control. He needed answers. "Yeah, it has," Richard said, his voice tight. He paused, struggling to find the right words. "Listen, James. I found something. Something about you and Emily." There was another pause, this time longer, the silence on the other end of the line thick with tension. Finally, James spoke, his voice cautious. "What? What are you talking about?" Richard gripped the phone tighter, trying to steady his nerves. "A letter. From you. To Emily. It was written years ago, but Sophie found it. It talks about you and Emily being involved. Is it true? Were you two together?" The weight of the question hung in the air, and Richard could feel his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment, there was only silence, and then James let out a slow, heavy sigh. "Richard, I never wanted you to find out like this," James said, his voice low and filled with regret. "But yes, it's true. Emily and I were involved before she met you. It was a long time ago, and we both agreed to leave it in the past. When she chose to be with you, I stepped aside." Richard closed his eyes, the confirmation hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had suspected it, but hearing the truth from James made it all too real. "Why didn't you tell me?" Richard asked, his voice breaking. Why did you keep this from me? You were my friend, James. I know, James replied, his voice filled with guilt. And I'm sorry. I should have told you. But when Emily chose you, I didn't want to complicate things. I thought it was over, that it didn't matter anymore. I never meant to betray you. Richard shook his head, his emotions boiling over. But it did matter. It mattered to me. I thought I knew everything about her, about our life together. And now I find out there was this whole part of her past that she never shared with me. I trusted you, James. I know, James said, his voice quiet and full of remorse. And I can't undo what's been done. But Richard, whatever happened between Emily and me, it ended before she met you. She loved you, man. She chose you. Richard felt a wave of conflicting emotions, anger, sorrow, and a deep sense of loss. I don't know how to process this. I spent years grieving her, and now I feel like I never even knew her. James was silent for a moment, then spoke again, his voice soft. I can't change what happened, Richard. But I can tell you this, Emily loved you. She made her choice. And whatever we had, it was in the past. Richard exhaled, feeling a mix of frustration and resignation. He had gotten the answers he sought, but they brought little comfort. I don't know where this leaves us, Richard said quietly. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. I understand, James replied, his voice heavy. And I'm truly sorry. If you never want to speak to me again, I get it. But I hope you'll remember that I never wanted to hurt you or Emily. There was a long silence before Richard finally spoke, his voice weary. I need time, James. I need time to figure this out. Take all the time you need, James said, his voice filled with regret. I'm sorry, Richard. Truly. Richard ended the call, the weight of the conversation settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had the answers now, but they only seemed to deepen the sense of betrayal and loss he felt. Emily had loved him, but she had also kept secrets. James had been his friend, but now that friendship felt tainted. Richard sat down, staring at the phone in his hand. The world felt different now, fractured in a way that couldn't be easily repaired. But amid the confusion and hurt, one thing remained clear: he had Sophie and Daniel. They were his future, and no matter what had happened in the past, he wasn't going to let it come between them. Taking a deep breath, Richard stood up and made his way to the window. The sun was setting behind the city skyline, casting a warm glow over the buildings. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to focus on what was ahead, not what had been lost. It would take time to heal, time to rebuild, but he was ready to move forward. One step at a time. Struggled to keep his emotions in check, but the sense of betrayal was overwhelming. The friend he had trusted, and the woman he had loved more than anything, had shared something behind his back, even if it had been before their relationship became serious. It didn't change the fact that it had been kept from him, buried in the past, only to resurface now like a wound he hadn't realized was festering. You should have told me, Richard said, his voice trembling with barely controlled anger. I had a right to know. Instead, I'm finding out now, years later, after I've already mourned her, already lost her. James's voice was soft, filled with guilt. I know. I was wrong. We both were. But Richard, it didn't mean what you think. Emily loved you. She chose you. Whatever we had, it wasn't meant to be. It wasn't some great love, it was something in the past. And I regret it. Richard stood by the window, staring out into the city, his mind racing. But it was still something. And neither of you told me. You let me go on thinking I knew everything about her, about our life together. I trusted you, James. I trusted her. There was a long silence on the other end. Finally, James spoke again, his voice low and pained. I'm sorry, Richard. I can't undo what happened. But I never meant to betray you. And I never wanted to hurt you. I was just scared. Scared of what it would do to us, to you." Richard's grip on the phone tightened, his knuckles white. "Well, it's done now. And I have to live with it." James sighed heavily. "I wish I had told you sooner. I wish we could have dealt with this when it happened. But I can't change the past. All I can say is that Emily loved you, and whatever you're feeling right now, I hope you don't let it take that away from you." Richard clenched his jaw, the mix of anger and sadness swirling inside him like a storm. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to the man who had been such a big part of his past, and now felt like a stranger. "I don't know if I can forgive you, James," Richard said quietly. "I don't know if I can forgive either of you. But I need time." "I understand," James said, his voice full of remorse. "Take all the time you need. And if you ever want to talk again, I'll be here." "I'm sorry, Richard. Truly." Richard ended the call without another word, feeling utterly drained. He stood there for a long time, the phone still in his hand, the weight of everything that had been said pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. He had wanted answers, and now he had them, but they brought him little peace. He thought of Emily, of their life together, of the love they had shared. It had been real, hadn't it? Even with this secret between them? He wasn't sure what to believe anymore. But as his thoughts spiraled, one thing remained clear in his mind: Sophie and Daniel. They were his family now, and whatever had happened in the past, he couldn't let it destroy the future he was trying to build with them. Taking a deep breath, Richard put the phone down and walked away from the window. He needed to focus on what mattered, on the people still in his life, the people he could still hold on to. The past was full of pain, but the future was still waiting. And for Sophie and Daniel, he was willing to do whatever it took to move forward, one step at a time. "Sorry, Dad," Sophie said softly after a long silence, her voice filled with empathy. "I can't imagine how hard this is for you. I didn't know what you'd find when you called him, but I thought you deserved to know the truth, even if it's painful." Richard nodded, the weight of the conversation with James still heavy on his chest. "I thought knowing would help," he said, his voice strained, "but it doesn't. It makes everything more complicated. I don't know how to reconcile what I know now with the life I thought I had with your mom." Sophie placed a comforting hand on his arm, her touch gentle but grounding. "I wish I could say something that would make it better, but I think this is something that's going to take time. I don't know if the answers you're looking for will ever make sense, but I do know that you loved her. And she loved you. Whatever happened in the past, it doesn't change that." Richard swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. "I want to believe that," he said quietly, "but right now, it feels like everything I knew about her is slipping away. And I don't know how to hold on to the good parts when there's so much I didn't know." Sophie nodded, understanding his struggle. "It's okay to feel like that," she said softly. "It's okay to be angry and hurt. But you don't have to figure it all out at once. We'll take it one step at a time, like we've been doing." Richard looked at her, the woman his daughter had become, and for a moment, his heart ached for all the years they had missed. But amid that pain, there was also hope for the future, hope for a connection that could still grow. "One step at a time," Richard repeated, his voice steadier now. He glanced over at Daniel, who was playing quietly on the floor, his little hands exploring the world with innocent curiosity. "I don't want this to come between us, Sophie. Whatever happens, whatever I need to work through, I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose this." Sophie smiled, her eyes softening. "You won't. We're in this together, remember?" Richard nodded, the knot in his chest loosening slightly. "I'm glad I have you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I'd be handling all this without you." "We'll figure it out," Sophie reassured him. "And whatever answers you need, we'll face them together." As they sat there in the quiet of the evening, the weight of the past still hung over them. But the promise of moving forward felt more real than it had in days. It wasn't going to be easy, Richard knew that. But with Sophie and Daniel by his side, he felt a glimmer of hope. They would take it one day at a time. And maybe, just maybe, they could find healing in the midst of all the pain. As Richard sat down, watching his grandson giggle and squirm in Sophie's arms, the sight warmed his heart in a way that was becoming more familiar each day. These moments, simple, quiet, and full of life, were what he had been missing for so long. Sophie looked over at him, her expression soft but thoughtful. "You know," she said gently, "I've been thinking a lot about everything. About Mom, about James, about us. And I keep coming back to the same thing. We can't change the past. But we can decide what to do with it." Richard nodded, feeling the truth of her words. The pain and confusion of the past still lingered, but it wasn't consuming him the way it had in the beginning. He had begun to see that the real work, the healing, was in how he chose to move forward. Not in trying to unravel every painful detail of what had happened. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "I spent so much time trying to make sense of it all, but maybe there's no real sense to be made. Maybe it's just about accepting what happened and focusing on what we have now." Sophie smiled softly, her eyes reflecting the same hope that Richard was beginning to feel. "Exactly. We have each other now, and we have Daniel. That's what matters." Richard looked at Daniel, his small hands reaching out to grab at the world around him, full of curiosity and innocence. "I don't want to lose this," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't want to lose you or Daniel. I know we have a lot to work through, but I want to be here. I want to be part of your lives." Sophie nodded, her smile widening. "You are. And we'll figure it out together. One step at a time, remember?" Richard chuckled softly, the phrase having become a mantra between them. "One step at a time," he repeated. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun glint off the surface of the lake. The sound of birds and children playing in the distance filling the air. Richard realized that for the first time in a long time, he felt lighter, freer. The truth about Emily and James, while painful, no longer had the same power over him. It was part of his past, yes, but it didn't have to define his future. As Daniel wriggled in Sophie's lap, Richard reached out, gently taking his grandson's tiny hand in his own. The simple gesture brought a swell of emotion to his chest, a deep gratitude for this new beginning. He looked at Sophie, the daughter he was finally getting to know, and smiled. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Sophie met his gaze, her eyes shining with understanding and warmth. "We have," she said softly. "And we've still got a long way to go. But we're getting there." Richard nodded, feeling that glimmer of hope once again. The path ahead might still be uncertain, but they were walking it together. And for the first time in a long time, Richard felt like that was enough. "And building something together," Richard continued, his voice steady with resolve. "The past will always be a part of us, but it doesn't have to dictate our future. I don't want to waste any more time looking back when I have so much to look forward to with both of you." Sophie smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of relief and warmth. "I'm really proud of you for that, Dad," she said softly, the word Dad slipping out naturally now, a sign of the growing bond between them. "I think it's the right choice. The past has been heavy for both of us, but you're right. What matters is what we do with the present and the future." Richard felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't that the pain or confusion had disappeared, but it no longer held the same grip on him. He had come to terms with the fact that some things couldn't be explained, and some wounds might never fully heal. But he also realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past, it was about learning to live with it and finding a way to move forward. As they continued to watch the ducks swimming lazily across the water, Daniel squirmed excitedly in Sophie's lap, his laughter filling the air. Richard reached out, brushing his grandson's tiny hand with his fingers, feeling a surge of love and gratitude. "This is what matters," Richard said quietly, his eyes on Daniel. "Being here for him, for you. That's what I'm going to focus on." Sophie nodded, her smile widening. "And we're glad to have you here. It's taken time, but I think we're finally getting to where we need to be." Richard chuckled softly. One step at a time, right? Sophie laughed lightly. Exactly. One step at a time. As they sat together, the warm afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the park, Richard allowed himself to fully embrace the moment. The future still held uncertainties, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. He was ready to face it alongside Sophie and Daniel. Whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was enough. Could have anticipated. His role as a grandfather began to take shape, not in grand gestures or major life changes, but in the small, meaningful moments that connected him more deeply to Sophie and Daniel. He found himself more present than he had ever been, learning to enjoy the simple joys of family life that had once felt so distant. He would visit Sophie and Daniel regularly, helping out in small ways, taking Daniel to the park, babysitting while Sophie ran errands, or just spending time with them, watching as Daniel grew and developed. Each day brought a new milestone, a new discovery, and with it, a deeper sense of fulfillment that Richard had never expected. One afternoon, as Richard sat on the floor playing with Daniel, who was now crawling around with increasing confidence, Sophie looked over at him from the kitchen, a smile on her face. "You're really good with him, you know," she said, her voice full of warmth. "I always wondered what it would be like to have my dad around, and now, I can't imagine you not being here." Richard paused, looking up at her, feeling that familiar lump in his throat. "I'm just trying to make up for lost time," he said softly. "But I'm glad I can be here now. I wouldn't trade it for anything." Sophie wiped her hands on a dish towel and came over, sitting beside them on the floor. "I think we've both made peace with the past," she said, her eyes meeting his. "What matters now is this, Daniel, us, the life we're building." Richard nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. "You're right. And I'm grateful for it. Every single day." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Daniel babble to himself as he played with his toys. Richard marveled at how much his life had changed in such a short time. The grief and regret that had once consumed him had been replaced by something far more powerful: love, connection, and a new sense of purpose. As the months passed, Richard found that the pain of the past no longer had the same hold on him. He would always carry it with him, of course, but it no longer defined him. He had a future to look forward to, a future with Sophie and Daniel. A future where he could be the father and grandfather he had always wanted to be. One evening, as they all sat together after dinner, Daniel fast asleep in Sophie's arms, Richard looked at his daughter and grandson and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. "I know I've said it before, but I want you to know how much this means to me," he said quietly. "Being part of your lives. It's the greatest gift I could have asked for." Sophie smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. "We're glad to have you, Dad. Daniel's lucky to have a grandfather like you." Richard's heart swelled at her words. He had spent so many years feeling lost, disconnected from the world around him. But now, in this moment, he felt like he had finally found his place. And for the first time in a long time, Richard knew that he was exactly where he was meant to be. Richard sat back in his chair, the quiet evening surrounding him like a comforting embrace. The skyline, once a reminder of everything he had lost, now symbolized something different, a future he was beginning to cherish. He thought back to how far he had come, how Sophie and Daniel had become the anchors he didn't know he needed. The relationship with Sophie was still a work in progress, filled with moments of vulnerability and openness. They didn't always have all the answers, and sometimes the questions about the past still resurfaced. But they were learning how to navigate the complexities together, with patience and understanding. Each day they spent together, their bond grew stronger, and with Daniel, Richard felt a sense of purpose he had thought was beyond him. Daniel had become a source of joy that filled Richard's heart in ways he never expected. Watching his grandson grow, discovering the world with curiosity, had given him a new appreciation for the simple moments he had missed out on in the past but was now fully embracing. Whether it was a day at the park or reading bedtime stories, those shared moments with Daniel made Richard feel alive again. As he gazed out at the fading sunset, Richard reflected on Emily. He still visited her grave occasionally, but the visits had changed. They weren't about holding on to the grief or the unanswered questions anymore. Instead, they were moments of reflection, acknowledging the love they had shared but recognizing that he needed to let go of the weight of the past to fully live in the present. He would always love Emily, but that love had evolved into something quieter. Something that allowed him to move forward without the bitterness and pain. Now, Richard realized his focus was on the future. He had found a family in Sophie and Daniel, and with them, a new sense of belonging. He hadn't expected this new chapter of his life, but it was one that he had come to cherish deeply. The loneliness that once defined him had faded, replaced by the warmth of connection and the promise of more moments to come. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the quiet contentment wash over him. It wasn't the life he had imagined all those years ago, but in many ways, it was even more meaningful. There was hope now, a future filled with love, family, and the possibility of more happiness. For the first time in years, Richard allowed himself to believe that the future, no matter how uncertain, could be bright. And as the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, he smiled, knowing that whatever lay ahead, he was ready to embrace it fully. "You've got some nerve to defy me." Out of nowhere, Stephen suddenly grabbed a beer roughly. "I'll treat a poor soul like you to a drink." In that moment, he dumped the beer over Ruby's head. "My name is Ryan Nelson. I'm 40 years old this year, and I usually live a happy life with my wife and son. My sister Ruby lives nearby, and even when I'm busy with work, she always looks out for my wife and son. To me, she's more than just a sister, she's been like a mother, so I'm grateful she gets along with my family. When I was still a toddler, our parents divorced, and Ruby and I were raised by our mother. But she passed away in an accident when I was in elementary school, and Ruby took care of me after that. That night, when our mother died, our home was filled with sadness and uncertainty. I was too young to understand, so I just cried, and Ruby, with tears in her eyes, held me close. Ryan, from now on, it'll just be the two of us. Let's stay strong." She said that, trying her best to encourage me. Ruby was still just a high school student back then. She juggled housework, taking care of me, and keeping up with her studies. Every morning, she'd wake up early to make breakfast, send me off to school, and then head to her own classes. As soon as she got back from school, she'd start making dinner and help me with my homework. "You've got to do your homework properly, Ryan," she'd say, while never neglecting her own studies. One day, I came home crying because something bad had happened at school, and she hugged me gently to comfort me. "Ryan, it's okay. I'm always here for you." She even talked to my teachers and did everything she could to solve my problems. Watching her, I was struck by how strong and kind she was. Every special occasion, she would save up her own money to buy me a present. On my birthday, she'd always manage to get a small cake for me. During summer break, we'd go to the fireworks festival together. As I watched the fireworks light up the night sky, I would smile innocently and say, "They're beautiful, aren't they, sis?" All thanks to her. "Yeah, they are, Ryan. Let's keep pushing forward together." Her words reassured me, and I realized just how much of a pillar of support she was for me. After graduating high school, Ruby started working right away and saved up money so I could go to college. Sure, there was some support from child support and our mom's life insurance, but it was mostly thanks to her that I made it through college. I really can't thank her enough. Thank you for putting me through college, sis. I promise I'll pay you back one day. When I said that, she smiled and replied, "The best way you can pay me back is by being happy, Ryan." After I graduated from college, I landed a job at a food company. It's a large company with many subsidiary groups. On my first day as a new employee, I was nervous but full of hope. I'm going to succeed here, no matter what. I made that vow to myself. For my first project, I worked hard with the help of my seniors. I stayed up late preparing documents and practiced my presentations repeatedly. All that effort paid off, and the project was a success. Ryan, great job. When my boss, Keith, praised me, I was filled with a sense of accomplishment. My hard work was recognized, and I even got promoted. During that time, I met my future wife. We first spoke at a company event and gradually grew closer. As we spent more time together, I was captivated by her kindness and strength. Eventually, we got married and had a son. Holding his tiny hand, I felt the responsibility and joy of being a father. Life with my family was filled with happiness every day. On weekends, we'd go on picnics in the park or take family trips. Watching my son grow made me realize how important family truly is. Ruby would always smile happily when she saw us together. Ryan, you've got a great family. I'm really happy, too. Ruby is married now and has kids of her own. It became a tradition for us all to gather together from time to time. Her husband treats me kindly, almost like a real brother. We've been through a lot, but now that both my work and family life are fulfilling, Ruby and I are truly happy. As I was lost in thought, Ruby tapped me on the shoulder. Hey, what are you grinning about? Startled by her voice, I turned around. I was just thinking how lucky and happy I am. She gave a wry smile at my words. That's nice and all, but we've got a dinner meeting with a client coming up, so you'd better stay sharp. You're right, I said, clearing my throat. Ruby and I were on our way to the venue in the car. Ryan, are you nervous about tonight's dinner? She asked, sounding a bit concerned. Yeah, a little. But having you here with me makes me feel a lot more confident. The venue was a fancy Japanese restaurant. We had a dinner meeting with a client tonight. This place has had a great reputation for years. The food's supposed to be amazing, and the atmosphere, too. Ruby said with a smile. The client runs a company that manages cafes and restaurants. I wonder what they'll be like, I asked. Ruby tilted her head thoughtfully. I haven't met them yet, so I'm not sure. But let's hope they're good people. We were in talks to develop a limited-time menu for their cafes. I'm really excited about working on the new menu. I'm sure we'll come up with something great. Ruby encouraged me. This would be my first time working with them, so tonight's dinner was an opportunity to build a good relationship. I heard Mr. Knight, the CEO, is coming tonight. You're right, I need to stay focused. Exactly. Show them what you've got. Feeling inspired by her words, I sat in the car, reaffirming my determination as we headed to the restaurant. Thanks, sis. Or rather, President Mitchell. I corrected myself, switching from casual to business mode. Ruby is here today, not as family, but as a business associate. Since it's a professional setting today, make sure you're on top of things, she said with a smile. Ruby is deeply involved in our business as well. In fact, she runs a large farm and serves as its head. After she sent me off to college, she began dedicating herself to her dream of managing a farm. She started learning agriculture from scratch, beginning with a small plot of land and gradually expanding the operation. Ryan, look at this. Don't these tomatoes look delicious? She proudly showed me the freshly harvested vegetables. At first, it was nothing but hardship. Crops were destroyed by typhoons, and pests were a constant issue. But Ruby never gave up. It'll be okay. Next time will be better. she would say, heading out to the fields day after day to keep working. Your farm has really made a name for itself lately. It was even featured in a magazine, I said, and she modestly replied, well, it's thanks to everyone's support. You're working hard too, so I can't afford to slack off. She supplies our company with vegetables and fruits, and her produce has earned a great reputation. Everyone at the company loves your vegetables. They say they're delicious, and the employees are really happy about it. For this joint project, her branded vegetables are absolutely essential. We can't pull off this menu without your vegetables, so I'm counting on you. That's why she's joining us for the meeting today. Of course, I'll give it my all, she said. Although I usually call her by her last name at work, being outside the office made me let my guard down. Sis, I really appreciate everything. It's because of you that I've been able to succeed. She blushed a little but responded in a gentle voice. What are you being so formal for? We're family. Helping each other is just natural. Her words made me feel deeply grateful once again. In both work and personal life, Ruby is a huge support for me. But today is business, so we need to switch to work mode. Yeah, you're right. President Mitchell, I look forward to working with you. I corrected my tone, getting back into the business mindset. Let's do our best, she said confidently, and I nodded firmly. We've arrived. Thank you. I thanked David from sales, who had driven us, and we stepped out of the car. The hostess of the restaurant greeted us and showed us to our room. This is where the dinner is, huh? It's got a nice atmosphere, Ruby said, smiling. Yeah. Time to give it my best, I replied, unable to hide my nervousness. As we entered the room, the employees from the client company welcomed us. I was just about to pull out my business card and start the introductions when an irritated voice interrupted. You're pretty late, aren't you? Turning toward the voice, I saw a man seated at the head of the table, glaring at us with a flushed face. The person looks to be in his late 30s. He definitely appears to be the youngest among the group. Although we had arrived ahead of schedule, it seemed they had gotten here even earlier. To my surprise, he had already started drinking. While the other employees hadn't touched their glasses yet, the man at the head of the table had already opened several bottles. My apologies for keeping you waiting. We look forward to working with you today. I bowed my head, and Ruby followed suit with her own greeting. My name is Ruby Mitchell. It's a pleasure to meet you. However, the man snorted in annoyance, giving us a cold glare. Making an important client wait this long? Are you all mocking us? And then you bring along a kid, an old woman, and this unimpressive-looking guy. I guess we're being taken lightly. He scoffed, pointing at me, Ruby, and David in turn, laughing derisively. I've often been told I look younger than my age, which has always been a bit of a sore spot for me. But this was the first time someone younger than me had called me a kid to my face. As Ruby and I stood silently, trying to suppress our frustration, David nervously spoke up. We were told that Mr. Knight, the president, would be joining us today. Huh? What, am I not good enough for you? My father's retired, and I just took over as president. I'm the one who's supposed to be here, got it? Ruby responded calmly. We were informed that he would be attending, so we prepared accordingly. I apologize if we've kept you waiting. I chimed in as well. We thought we were arriving a bit early, but I appreciate you getting here even earlier. The man still looked displeased. Even so, you're late. But whatever, sit down already. He tossed his business card toward us carelessly. I picked it up and, as expected, it listed his title and name. It seemed this man's name was Stephen. One of the employees, who had been sitting quietly, hesitantly spoke up. Actually, the previous president has had back problems, and just recently handed things over to his son, Stephen. We were going to notify you. But Stephen insisted it wasn't necessary. Though it was my first time meeting this Stephen, it was clear that he had a difficult personality. I see, that must have been tough. Ruby replied, still composed. However, a quick heads up would have made things go a bit smoother. I added my own thoughts. Stephen laughed through his nose. No need for a heads up. I'm the president now, that should be enough for you. Even in this tense situation, I kept my composure, smiling as I politely introduced myself and bowed to Stephen and the others. But before I could state my full name and title, Stephen interrupted again. Ah, that's enough. As long as I know your name. I bet it's not much of a title anyway. And what about the old woman over there? She looks pretty useless, what does she do? My fists clenched involuntarily. What is with this rude man? Sis, stay calm. I whispered to Ruby, trying to keep my cool. If he only cared about knowing our names, then so be it. He'd regret his ignorance later when he learned my position. I was sure of that. We're all equals in this meeting. Please show us the respect we deserve. Ruby responded firmly, not backing down. Stephen went silent for a moment, but then stifled a laugh. Equals? Well, whatever. Let's see what you've got. Entertain me, show me what you're worth. Suppressing my anger, I took a deep breath and continued. Thank you for the opportunity. We look forward to working with you. Despite his crude behavior, I wondered if Stephen really understood who he was dealing with. Even if he was drunk, he should have known at least a little about our company. Could it be that he came here completely unprepared? Sensing my discomfort, Ruby lightly taps my back where no one can see. Ryan, you'll be fine. Stay calm. She whispered softly. Her words helped settle my nerves a bit. I couldn't afford to lose my composure over Stephen's attitude. My name is Ruby Mitchell, and I run the farm. I've been invited here today because my branded vegetables are a key component of the joint project we're discussing. Thanks to Ruby's calm and professional demeanor, the atmosphere in the room began to ease slightly. I steeled myself, ready to face this situation alongside Ruby. Oh yeah, my old man did mention something about that. He said your vegetables were so good, he'd love to have them supplied to us. Stephen said with a sly grin. We're honored to hear that. We take great pride in growing our produce. Ruby responded calmly. Sure, using good veggies is important, but let's see if you can prove you're worth it. Stephen added with a smirk. Determined, I replied, we'll do our best to meet your expectations. Ruby nodded and added firmly, let's work together to create something truly special. Stephen paused for a moment, then smiled again, I'll be looking forward to it. How about this? Let's make a deal. You should be grateful, old lady, getting a contract with us would be a lucky break for you, right? I'm sorry, but Ms. Mitchell's farm is under an exclusive contract with us. David immediately interjected, rejecting Stephen's offer. Ruby and I both nodded in agreement, and Stephen's face twisted in annoyance. Ha! I'm doing this poor old woman a favor here. You low-level employees should just shut up. I couldn't understand why Stephen assumed Ruby was poor, knowing nothing about her. And calling us low-level employees. That's incredibly disrespectful. I found myself shouting before I could stop. Oh, so someone who isn't even part of this company dares to talk back to me? Stephen, clearly drunk, glared at me with bloodshot eyes. Just as I was about to retort, Ruby stepped in, her voice steady and composed. We appreciate your offer, but we must decline. Our vegetables deserve better than to be sold to a company run by someone as rude as you. I won't let our precious produce be sent off to such a place. Stephen stood there, stunned for a moment, visibly trembling. What do you mean by that? His voice shook as he demanded an explanation. Just what I said. Our vegetables are of the highest quality, and we only work with those who appreciate that. Ruby replied calmly, unwavering in her stance. Stephen's face turned red with anger. How dare you talk to me like that? You'll regret this. Though my fists clenched again in anger, I took a deep breath, trying to stay composed. Sis, that's enough. Let's go, I said, giving her a look to signal it was time to leave. Yes, there's no point in staying here any longer. We were about to leave the place. Stephen stands up. Stephen, please calm down. His employees pleaded, trying to restrain him, but he wouldn't listen. You think you can act high and mighty? Who do you think you are? A poor nobody trying to defy someone as rich as me, huh? You've got guts. Suddenly, Stephen grabbed a beer bottle roughly. Let me treat you poor folks to some beer, he said, and in an instant, he poured the beer over Ruby's head. Ah! I tried to shield her, but I wasn't quick enough. The room fell silent, the tension thick in the air. Sis, are you okay? I quickly pulled a towel from my bag and handed it to her. Though she tried to remain calm, tears welled up in her eyes. I'm fine, Ryan. Don't worry. I felt a surge of anger rising within me, but I took a deep breath, trying to appear calm. Stephen's reckless actions showed just how thoughtless and short-tempered he was. For a brief moment, it seemed like he realized what he had done, but still, no apology came. I won't tolerate any more of this disrespect. As I made my declaration, everyone in the room tensed up, watching the situation unfold. Stephen's face was a mix of surprise and anger. His subordinates were also flustered, clearly unsure of how to respond. Despite his nervous glances around the room, Stephen tried to maintain his bravado, snorting as he spoke to Ruby. How's that taste, poor woman? I'm sure you get the message now. You don't belong here. Why don't you and that useless guy just head home? His words froze the entire room. The contract is over. I muttered quietly, turning to leave. Ryan, wait. Ruby grabbed my arm, stopping me. We can't end it like this. Her voice was firm, and I stopped in my tracks. Stephen, your behavior is unacceptable, Ruby said, standing tall. We didn't come here to be treated with such disrespect. The room fell silent as everyone listened to her words. Who do you think you are, acting all high and mighty? What do you even know? Stephen spat back, but everyone in the room was now staring at him with cold, disapproving eyes. I suppressed my anger and allowed a small smile to play on my lips. Oh, I know plenty. Enough to recognize how low your character is. You're the one who doesn't belong here. So, who are you with again? Which company do you represent? At my question, Stephen burst out laughing, but his laughter was strained. He must have realized the seriousness of what he had done and was surely shaken. Ha! You must have a terrible memory, poor man. I'm Stephen, the president of the company that does business with your firm. What's the point of this question? And what's with your tone? If you keep this up, I'll. His subordinates were desperately trying to restrain him, clearly struggling to keep him from causing more damage. Some of them had already resigned themselves to the situation, standing silently as if they knew it was too late. I cut him off, maintaining my calm smile. I see. So you do understand your position as president. Good to know. Well, then, we'll be taking our leave. Oh. And be sure to inform your father that our joint project is no longer happening. I said to Ruby, let's go. She was deeply shocked by the fact that she had been drenched in beer. Tears welled up in her eyes, and her clothes were soaked, but she still managed to stay strong. By the way, I didn't get a chance to introduce myself properly earlier. I said, handing Stephen my business card. On it, my full title was clearly written. Our company operates over 100 stores nationwide. And I'm the president of the headquarters. Though I had only recently taken over, my position was legitimate. In an instant, Stephen's face went pale. This can't be real. He muttered in a trembling voice. The subordinates stand frozen like statues, letting out deep sighs. It's clear they knew who I was. A quick look at the company's website would show both my picture and title. Under normal circumstances, anyone would have prepared for a meeting like this, knowing exactly who they were dealing with. But judging by Stephen's behavior, they had given up trying to stop him halfway through. I could understand that, but it was still strange. Not only did they fail to stop him, but none of them even attempted to apologize for his insults and violence. This company clearly had deeper issues. Maybe they were too scared of Stephen to act. Either way, it was an unbelievable situation. What's going on? Even though he was drunk, he must have realized the seriousness of the situation. Stephen stood there trembling. Wait, please. He called after us, but we ignored him as we left the restaurant. With my arm gently around Ruby's shoulders, we stepped outside into the cold night air. Sis, are you okay? I asked, concerned. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, don't worry about me, she said, though her voice trembled. I drove her home right after we left the restaurant. Take tomorrow off and rest, I told her as we sat in the car. Thanks, Ryan. But I'll be fine, don't worry. She replied with a brave smile, though I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. More than anything, I was worried about how deeply the incident had affected her. Today, she was out in the fields working at her farm, but I planned to check on her later to make sure she was all right. The next day, I went to the office as usual. Mr. Nelson, sorry to interrupt, but you have visitors. Alice, my secretary, informed me as I was deep in thought. Visitors? I don't have any appointments at this time, I said, puzzled. Alice then told me that Stephen and his father had come to see me. Ah, I see. It's about yesterday. I sighed, realizing what it was about. They were probably here to apologize. I couldn't just ignore them completely. All right, show them in, I said, standing up and instructing Alice to join me in the meeting. She nodded and led the night father and son to my office. I'll show them into the president's office now, Alice said politely as she guided them. As soon as they entered the room, both father and son immediately bowed to the floor, pressing their foreheads down in apology. My son's behavior was absolutely unacceptable. We are terribly sorry. They repeated their apologies with their heads to the floor. We knew how large your company was, but we never expected the president of the main office himself to come. Stephen began to make excuses, but I shook my head. It was planned for the company presidents to meet and introduce themselves. Since we'll be working together, I wanted to have a proper discussion. But as you saw, things ended up the way they did. I spoke in a calm but firm tone. Your actions were completely unacceptable. Stephen's father, with tears in his eyes, once again bowed deeply, continuing his apologies. I am truly, truly sorry. Please, won't you give us one more chance? Stephen, his head still lowered, took a deep breath and finally spoke. I sincerely apologize for my rude behavior. Please forgive me. I stared at the two of them in silence for a while, then let out a deep sigh. Yesterday was deeply regrettable. But this issue cannot be resolved so easily. I looked at both of them with a stern gaze. First, I need to hear a proper apology from Stephen directly to Ruby. Stephen's father turned toward him, and with a trembling voice, Stephen spoke again. I'm really sorry, to your sister as well. I entrusted my son with running the company due to my worsening back issues, and I trusted him to communicate with all of you properly. I never imagined he would act so disgracefully. I deeply apologize. My son will face appropriate consequences for his actions. Please, I ask that you reconsider continuing our business relationship. Hearing his father's words, Stephen's eyes widened in shock. What? Father, you can't be serious. Stephen's father seems desperate to at least keep the business on track. It appears that continuing the deal is more important to him than offering an apology. I sighed in exasperation. It seems you don't understand the gravity of the situation. Is continuing the business really all that matters to you? At my words, his father bowed his head again. No, of course not. But please, give us one more chance. Stephen's face was a mix of panic and anger. Dad, I gave Stephen a stern look. Do you even understand how serious yesterday's incident was? Stephen looked down, speechless. Forget the business deal for now. First, you need to reflect on your own actions. I declared firmly. I have no intention of changing my mind. I will be filing a report regarding the assault. There were many witnesses to your son's actions. Among the witnesses were not just us and Stephen's subordinates, but also the staff at the restaurant. They were concerned, especially after seeing the state of Ruby. When Stephen heard the words "file a report," his face went pale, and he let out a frantic cry. What? Wait a minute, a report? His face turned a sickly shade, filled with panic and fear. You've gotta be kidding me. You're blowing this way out of proportion for something like this. At that moment, his father bowed deeply once again. I deeply apologize, Mr. Nelson. Please reconsider one more time. Your son's behavior is absolutely unacceptable. Further discussion is pointless. His father's face sank into despair at my words. Please, I'm begging you. But I shook my head. My decision is final. Please leave. What the hell? You're making such a big deal over a little spilled beer. And who'd believe someone like you is actually the president? This feels like a setup. Besides, that woman should have moved out of the way. Fool, shut up. His father quickly stepped in to stop him, but I couldn't help but laugh at Stephen's ridiculous logic. Is that your excuse? I said, smirking coldly. I knew you lacked the awareness of a leader, but I didn't realize it was this bad." Stephen's face flushed red with anger. "What? You're saying I'm the one at fault? You're the ones making a big deal out of nothing." In that moment, my expression turned serious and I spoke calmly. "You are mistaken if you think you can dismiss me because I appear young. The real issue here is your attitude." "Ha!" His father, holding his head in his hands, desperately tried to persuade him. "Enough, Stephen, be quiet," but Stephen wasn't listening. "I won't lose to the likes of you." Stephen kept shouting until the atmosphere in the room had completely frozen over. "The woman you insulted, the one you called poor, is someone I deeply care about. She's my family. If Ruby is in danger, of course I will protect her. And if she's insulted, it's only natural to be angry. Am I wrong?" When I explained this, Stephen's eyes widened in shock. "Yes, I'm standing up for the sister who has always been there for me. She has supported and encouraged me for years. The idea of her being humiliated and having beer poured over her head is something I simply cannot allow. I got married and took over as president from Mr. Kennedy a few years ago. I take pride in my new role, always holding a deep sense of gratitude for Ruby. Without her support, I wouldn't be where I am today." As I reflected on the past, I continued speaking. "And another thing, yesterday, Stephen was surrounded by many of his employees, yet none of them acted. They just stood there like statues, silently watching his mood. Despite witnessing numerous outrageous acts, not a single one of them apologized to us. This goes beyond a simple issue of employee training." My voice was cold, echoing through the room. Stephen's face turned red, and he looked down, unable to say anything. "Do you really think a company with employees like yours can succeed?" I continued. "A company is made up of its people. Every individual's actions build the company's reputation. But it seems you don't understand that at all." Stephen's father bowed his head again, tears welling up in his eyes. "I am truly sorry. I apologize for my son's disrespect." Stephen, visibly emotional, slammed his fist on the floor and shouted, "Damn it! I only took that job because I thought I'd get free food and drinks. This is a disaster." Stephen spat out his words, full of frustration. I sighed again. "In any case, I will not change my mind. After all that's happened, your apologies are nothing but empty words. Please leave." Yet, neither Stephen nor his father made any attempt to stand. It was a waste of time. Stephen's father looked at me with desperate, pleading eyes, but I maintained my calm expression. "Please leave. I don't want to have anything to do with you anymore." As I said this again, Alice, who had remained silent until now, made a phone call. Moments later, security arrived and escorted Stephen and his father out. "What do you think you're doing? We're not finished here." Stephen screamed, but the security guards held him firmly. His father, still bowing deeply with tears in his eyes, led his son out of the president's office. In the silence that followed, the only sound was the soft pouring of tea from Alice as she prepared it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Good work, Mr. Nelson." Alice spoke quietly. "Thank you, you went through a lot as well." I expressed my gratitude to her. Taking a sip of the tea, I reflected on the whole situation. It made me realize the importance of standing firm, no matter how difficult the circumstances. And more than anything, I was certain that I had made the right decision for Ruby's sake. Later, Stephen's father reached out again, asking for reconsideration on the contract and the police report, but I firmly refused. "Please, reconsider one more time." His voice was desperate, but I shook my head without hesitation. "I'm sorry, but my decision remains unchanged." As promised, I filed the report with the police. There were many witnesses, and further investigations revealed that Stephen had a history of mistreating his subordinates. This wasn't the first time. As the police investigation continued, more disturbing facts came to light. In the end, Stephen received the punishment he deserved. During the trial, Stephen remained silent as the verdict was read. His face showed both regret and fear. Afterward, he formally apologized to Ruby, and we received compensation, cutting all ties with the Knight family. "It's finally over." I let out a deep breath. Stephen's company had lost its credibility and faced a wave of contract cancellations. Their reputation in the industry plummeted, and it would be a long road to rebuild their trust, if it was even possible. This is reality. One careless action can lead to losing everything. This is especially true for those in positions of responsibility. And above all, I could never forgive what they did to Ruby. Ruby, who had beer thrown on her, is worried about the deal falling through. No matter how much I told her, "Don't worry about it," she couldn't help but blame herself. "Just like you always care about me, I care about you too, sis. So please, keep smiling." At that moment, Ruby finally gave me a tearful smile. "Thank you, Ryan. I'm truly lucky." Her words brought a sense of relief to all of us. Family grows stronger by staying together. I felt that strongly in my heart. I vowed to continue supporting each other as a family, living each day with smiles. When I glanced up at the sky, it was clear and bright, filling me with a renewed sense of hope. "Let's keep moving forward together, sis." I whispered this to myself as I took the first step toward our new beginning. What did you just do?" "Pervert. Molester." She screamed and began sobbing uncontrollably, turning her back on me to hide her exposed chest. I tried to explain that I had only administered first aid after she collapsed, but she refused to listen. Before long, an ambulance arrived, and she was taken to the hospital. With red, swollen eyes, she shot me a sharp glare. "Just wait. I'm telling my dad about this." I stood there in a daze, watching as the ambulance drove away. Suddenly, I remembered I had a job interview later. Panicking, I checked the time, only to realize I was already way past the appointment. A woman collapsed on the sidewalk. Because I helped her, I ended up missing my interview. But even so, someone reached out to save me. My name is Steve. I'm currently in the middle of job hunting. Today, I had an interview with Moonlight Travel Agency. I used to work for a trading company. It wasn't related to the travel industry, but my job took me all over the world. During my downtime, I enjoyed visiting famous local spots, eating at renowned restaurants, and connecting with the locals. I wanted to work in a job where I could use those experiences. Moonlight Travel Agency is a small company, but their slogan, "Experience the world's most breathtaking views while you're alive," really resonated with me. Their customer reviews are great too. I'm sure the company will grow. I want to be a part of that. As soon as I stepped out of the station, the pedestrian traffic lights at the crosswalk in front of me started blinking green. I arrived 30 minutes early for the interview, so I had plenty of time. Everything's fine. I calmed my slightly jittery legs and waited for the traffic lights to turn green. Just then, a man in a suit rushed past me, looking panicked. The pedestrian traffic lights had already turned red, and cars were starting to move. "Danger!" Before I could even shout, The man was hit by a car. A scream echoed from a woman. The man, who had been driving the car, rushed over to the man who was lying on the road. "Someone call an ambulance," he shouted, so I quickly grabbed my phone and dialed 911. One of the women waiting at the traffic lights called out, "I'm a nurse," and rushed to the injured man. Watching her take charge so confidently gave me a sense of relief. But then, I heard a loud thud behind me. Turning around, I saw a woman lying on the sidewalk. Her sunflower-patterned skirt caught the light. But it wasn't the time to think about that right now. Onlookers started murmuring, "What's going on?" but no one moved to help her, just furrowing their brows in confusion. Some people were even walking away, leaving her behind. Pushing past those indifferent people, I rushed over to her. I checked her for breathing. No breathing. No pulse either. "Excuse me, the lady with the pink hair. Could you run to the convenience store and grab an AED?" "Me?" The college-aged girl I pointed at yelped but quickly dashed toward the store. While waiting, I moved the woman to a safer spot at the edge of the sidewalk and began chest compressions. It was my first time performing first CPR. I had only practiced it a few times in training sessions. I vaguely remembered the instructor saying, "It's okay if you break a rib, just press hard." Feeling nervous about whether I was doing it right, I followed what I had learned. As I continued, the pink-haired girl returned. I checked the woman's breathing and pulse, still nothing. "I'm going to use the AED, please step back." The girl who had brought the AED quickly jumped away. Everyone else had already left, as if they thought they no longer had a part to play. I opened the AED and turned it on. Following the voice instructions, I pulled out the electrode pads. When it instructed me to attach the pads to her body, I hesitated for a moment. Excuse me, could you help me place these on her?" I asked the pink-haired girl, but she shook her head frantically. "No way, I can't." There was no time to hesitate. This was a life-or-death situation. I remembered that you didn't have to remove all the clothes as long as the pads were applied to bare skin. I unbuttoned just a bit of her pale green blouse and tried to place the pad on the upper right side of her chest. At that moment, my eyes widened in shock. There was a large scar across her chest. Was it from an accident? Realizing I had paused, I shook my head and quickly resumed the procedure. I placed the other pad below her left chest, and the AED determined that a shock was needed, so I pressed the button. It instructed me to resume chest compressions, and I followed the instructions. As they repeated it a few times, she groaned and started coughing. "Thank goodness, she's alive." Relief washed over me, and I sank to the ground. The woman winced and opened her eyes. When she tried to sit up, she seemed to notice her open blouse and gasped, covering herself hurriedly. Then, she glared at me. What did you do to me?" "Pervert. Molester. Wait, you collapsed, and I. Don't look at me." She turned away, sobbing uncontrollably. Quickly fastening the buttons of her blouse, she stood up. But she seemed to feel faint, and her body swayed. I instinctively reached out to support her. But the next moment, her hand came flying toward my left cheek in a sharp slap. "Don't touch me." Just then, the ambulance arrived. They were already loading the man who had been hit by the car onto a stretcher. "Over here." This girl collapsed too, but she just regained consciousness. The woman who had brought the AED called out to the paramedics. One person rushed over, asking, "Are you okay?" and glanced at the AED spread out on the ground. "Are you okay? Please come with us. We'll check you over just to be sure." The woman nodded quietly, but before getting into the ambulance, she shot me a piercing glare with her tear-streaked, red eyes. "Just wait. I'm telling my dad about this." I stood there in shock as I watched the ambulance drive away. Suddenly, I remembered my interview. Panicking, I checked the time, only to find that the appointment time had long passed. I rushed to the Moonlight Travel Agency building, but I was turned away at the door with a firm, "Lateness is unacceptable." Needless to say, I later received a rejection letter from them. A few days after receiving the rejection letter from Moonlight Travel Agency, I tried to move on and continue my job search. What's done is done. It's important to move forward. Today, I didn't have any interviews lined up. I decided to visit the job center for some career advice and stepped out of my apartment. Just then, a sleek, black car, clearly expensive at first glance, came to a silent stop in front of the apartment. That car felt completely out of place in front of this apartment, where the rent was only a few $100s a month. Was one of the residents related to someone wealthy? I'd never heard anything like that. As I pondered, a man stepped out of the car. When I recognized his face, my eyes widened in shock. It was Mr. Adams, the CEO of Moonlight Travel Agency. I had seen his picture on the company's website many times. Then, to my even greater surprise, a woman stepped out of the car after him. She was the very same woman I had saved on the day of my missed interview, wearing a yellow cardigan this time. Could she be an employee of Moonlight Travel Agency too? As I stared at them in disbelief, the woman's eyes met mine. "Oh, Dad, that's him," she murmured, looking away awkwardly as she tugged at Mr. Adams's sleeve. "You're the one who saved Hannah." Mr. Adams rushed toward me with his arms wide open. He grabbed my hand and shook it vigorously up and down. As I stood there, dumbfounded, he pulled a business card from the inside pocket of his jacket. "I'm David Adams, the CEO of Moonlight Travel Agency. I heard that you saved my daughter's life the other day. I can't thank you enough." He bowed his head deeply, then shot a stern look at Hannah. Hannah bit her lip before bowing her head as well. "I'm so sorry for calling you names and accusing you of being a pervert back then. You saved my life, and I didn't even thank you." In the ambulance, after I explained everything, the paramedics scolded me. They said I might not have woken up if it weren't for you. Looking into Hannah's eyes as she glanced up at me cautiously, I could tell she truly felt sorry. "I'm just glad you understand. Thank you for coming all this way to apologize and express your gratitude." No, Mr. Adams said, "visiting the person who saved my daughter's life is the least I could do. Besides, I have something to ask you. You had an interview scheduled with my company that day, didn't you?" "Yes, I did." "Are you still job hunting? Or have you found a position somewhere else?" "No, I'm still looking." "That's fortunate for us, then. Steve, if you're willing, I would like to offer you a job at my company." "Wait, what?" It felt as if a path that had been closed off had suddenly opened right before me. I've heard that when Hannah collapsed, many people just walked by and ignored her. But you were the one who rushed to her aid. Someone with that sense of justice, who can remain calm in a crisis, is exactly the kind of person we need. Please consider joining us. Please, I'm asking as well. It's my fault you missed your interview." With both of them bowing their heads to me, I couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. I've actually really wanted to join your company. So, I'd be thrilled if you would hire me. Please, I look forward to working with you." "Is that so?" "Thank you, Steve. We look forward to working with you too." I firmly shook the hand Mr. Adams offered. Beside us, Hannah let out a small sigh of relief. And so, a month passed since I successfully joined Moonlight Travel Agency. As I arrived at the main office and was about to head up in the elevator, Hannah slipped in right behind me. "Good morning." "Good morning, Steve." No one else joined us, and the elevator quietly closed its doors and began to ascend. Being alone with Hannah made me feel a bit tense. After joining the company, I was assigned to the department where she served as the senior manager. So, we were headed to the same place. While I frantically searched for something to talk about, she broke the silence first. "Everyone's been talking about how quickly you're standing out in the department. The overseas travel plan, which had been stuck for a while, started moving smoothly as soon as you took over. We didn't have anyone knowledgeable about foreign affairs or languages before you. I'm glad my previous job experience is coming in handy. If we can also attract more customers from abroad to visit the US, our sales will definitely increase. You're really dependable." Hannah's smile made my heart skip a beat. She was like a sunflower, bright and cheerful, with a personality that lit up the room. Her presence alone seemed to make everything around her feel lighter. The impression I had of her from our first meeting was completely different now. While I was lost in admiration, the elevator doors opened. I regretted that our conversation had to end, but Hannah didn't seem to think twice as she quickly stepped out. "Good morning, Hannah." Several senior male colleagues hurried over to greet her as soon as they saw her. Hannah responded with a warm smile and a good morning. The senior colleagues, after discreetly pumping their fists with a quiet yes. I got to greet Hannah again today, began preparing to head out for their fieldwork. I opened my laptop to check my emails before heading out myself. The senior female colleague called Laura, who sat next to me, stretched her arms lazily above her head. Another day out in the field. I don't even like traveling, so I'm terrible at putting together plans for inns or recommending nearby attractions. "Hey, Steve, can you go in my place?" "Hey, don't push your work onto the junior staff." Hannah's reprimand came swiftly, and the senior pouted in response. "Oh, come on. This is all about putting the right person in the right job. Steve's better at this, and he'll create a plan that'll make the inns happier than anything I could do. If you keep piling your work on Steve, he'll get overwhelmed." I couldn't help but glance over at Hannah. She was staring at the senior with a firm, chastising look. The senior, looking disgruntled, noisily stood up from her chair. Yeah, I'll do it. Must be nice for you, though, being able to stay in the office all day as the department head." I noticed Hannah's eyes drop slightly at the comment. I frowned at Laura, who was still sulking. There were a few colleagues like her who were frustrated that Hannah only handled office work and rarely went out for field inspections or business trips. For some reason, it was an unspoken rule that Hannah stayed in the office most of the time. "Laura, someone has to stay in the office in case of emergencies, right? That's why the department head stays behind." "I guess that's true." Laura sighed, then turned to Hannah with a small bow. "Sorry, I went too far." After her apology, she headed out of the office. It was about time for me to head out too, or I'd be late for my appointment. I shut down my computer and grabbed my bag. "Thank you, Steve." Hannah's eyebrows were furrowed slightly, her expression a little downcast. "It was nothing, really. I'll be back soon." I smiled, hoping to lift her spirits, and left the office. As I watched Hannah's shoulders slump, I couldn't help but feel a little concerned. Next week, we'll be going to Spring Rain Inn to preview their tour plan. Since it's a couple's plan, it will be two people, a man and a woman. So, it will be me and Steve. Hannah's announcement stirred up a buzz in the office, particularly among the male employees. You're lucky, Steve, getting to go to the hot springs with Hannah. And it's for the couple's plan? So you're going to have to act like a couple, right? Even if it's just pretend, getting to be Hannah's boyfriend? That's one hell of a perk. Although envious, my senior colleagues still cheered me on with comments like, "Good luck, and just don't overstep, alright?" It was comforting to know that everyone in the company was so supportive. But why Steve? He just started here, didn't he? Idiot, Steve's a workhorse. He's been killing it ever since he joined. Fair enough. But it's still rare for Hannah to go out in the field, right? This might be her first time, actually. Yeah, that's true. With that, the seniors returned to their desks. I couldn't help but feel puzzled myself. Why would they take the newest employee like me on my first field work assignment? And for a couple's plan, no less. Could it be that she thought I'd be fine pretending to be her boyfriend? Maybe she actually likes me? I let my imagination run wild, and before I knew it, I had made a mistake entering some data. Thankfully, it was an easy fix, but I mentally reminded myself to stay focused. Before I knew it, the day of the site inspection with Hannah arrived. Given the nature of the plan, we were staying over a weekend, when couples were most likely to visit. Most guests drove to Spring Rain Inn, so we were traveling by car. Naturally, I was the one driving. Hannah, sitting in the passenger seat, was unusually quiet. Normally bright and cheerful, today her face was tense, and her lips were pressed tightly together. She even looked a little pale. Are you all right? Are you feeling car sick? I asked, trying to stay calm despite my growing concern, although I had been driving as smoothly as possible. Hannah shook her head. I'm fine. You're a really good driver, Steve. Thank you. Do you mind if I hold on to something, just for a bit? Hold on to. Not your hand or anything, maybe just your, clothes. Just for a moment. Of course, go ahead. I smiled, glancing at her briefly, and saw her let out a small sigh of relief as she lightly pinched the hem of my shirt. Her expression softened, just a little. But she had started to say hand. Did she actually want to hold my hand? Could this mean she liked me? Was she trying to use this opportunity to get closer? As these thoughts filled my mind, my heart started pounding. I can't, I'm driving right now. I need to calm down. But now, I couldn't stop noticing the slight tug on my shirt. Even though she wasn't touching my skin. Battling a sweet tension, I somehow managed to drive safely and arrived at Spring Rain Inn. The landlady greeted us and led us to the room that had been prepared specifically for the couple's plan tour. Since it was a couple's plan, of course, we only had one room. I knew that, but still, the thought of being alone with Hannah made my heart race. I glanced at her, but she didn't seem the least bit concerned. Her eyes sparkled as she admired the room, saying, "Wow, what a lovely room." This room comes with a private outdoor bath, the landlady explained. Dinner will be served here in your room, so you can enjoy it at your leisure. And since this room is far from the other guest rooms, there's no need to worry about being disturbed, no matter what you do. Her knowing smile made my heart skip a beat. I forced a laugh, trying to hide the heat rising to my face. Well, we're just here for an inspection. We'll bring your dinner around 7, the landlady said, before leaving the room. Now, it was just the two of us. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees outside was the only thing breaking the silence that now filled the room. "All right, let's enjoy the outdoor bath," Hannah suddenly said, starting to undress. I panicked and quickly turned my back. "Wait. Don't just start undressing here. Use the changing area, please." Despite my protest, I could still hear the sound of clothes rustling. She was still undressing. My heart pounded so hard, I thought it might explode. "Come on, Steve, hurry up and get undressed. We can't fully experience the couple's plan unless we do it together." Even though I heard her voice behind me, I couldn't move. "Steve?" My arm was suddenly yanked forcefully. Because it happened so suddenly, I couldn't help but turn around to face her. But she wasn't naked, she was wearing a swimsuit. A tank top and shorts. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but I couldn't deny the slight hint of disappointment that lingered. With more of her skin exposed, my eyes naturally drifted to the scar on her chest. The same one I had seen when I saved her. Hannah seemed to be aware of my gaze, looking up at me with a tense expression. Her hand, still gripping my arm, tightened. I forced myself to look into her eyes. "So, you were wearing a swimsuit underneath. You should have said so earlier." "I didn't bring one, so go ahead without me. I'll join you after I change." She released her grip on my arm, still looking up at me. "All right. I'll go ahead, then." After making sure she'd gone out to the outdoor bath, I took out my swimsuit from my bag and changed. Then, I headed to the outdoor bath as well. I was still feeling tense, so I walked carefully, making sure not to slip. Quietly, I joined Hannah, who was already enjoying the outdoor bath. The bath was small, and unless I was careful to stay in the corner, my skin might brush against hers. The sound of rustling leaves and the gentle flow of the nearby river gradually eased my tension. The warm water soaking into my body helped too. This view is incredible. It really fits with our company's slogan. Experience the world's most breathtaking views while you're alive. But it seems a waste to limit it to couples. I think families could also enjoy this, especially parents with kids who might appreciate not having to worry if their children get too noisy. There was no reply. I turned to look at her and saw that she was gazing down, her hand gently touching the scar on her chest. I hesitated, unsure whether I should say something. "Why did you bring me along for this inspection? I'm still new in the company." Avoiding the topic of her scar, I brought up what I'd been wondering about ever since she'd chosen me. Hannah slowly raised her head. "Because I thought you'd be okay. I'm aware of the feelings some people have toward me. If I brought someone who liked me into this kind of situation, they might not be able to control themselves." Though she claimed to understand how others felt about her, she didn't seem to realize how I felt. Feeling a bit dejected, I pulled my knees up to my chest under the water. Even I'm holding myself back. In that moment, I truly wanted to reach out, extend a hand or foot, just to touch her. I could hear the chirping of birds from somewhere. As a distraction, I focused my attention on the sound. "You're not asking anything." I widened my eyes at the words that were quietly dropped. Hannah was once again touching the scar on her chest, and I realized that's what she meant. "You don't want to talk about it, right? So I won't ask." Everyone has something they'd rather keep to themselves. But, scar or not, you're still Hannah. You're the bright, incredible woman who always lights up the room, someone I really look up to. "I see." Her face flushed slightly. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I think I'll get out now. Don't stay in too long, or you might get dizzy." I quietly slipped out of the outdoor bath. I dried off, changed into my gown, and, before leaving, glanced through the window to check on Hannah. She was hunched over, her shoulders trembling. Seeing that, I quietly left her alone. After enjoying the outdoor bath, we spent some time exploring the relaxation room and wandered around the nearby souvenir shops and tourist spots. Hannah seemed refreshed, taking photos and chatting with the shopkeepers. By the time we returned to our room just before 7, we were ready to indulge in the dinner that was brought to us. Once we had finished and I had summarized the day's events in the report, I closed my laptop. The day's work was officially done. "Good job, Steve. Here you go." Hannah, who had finished earlier, handed me a cup of the local sake. As I took a sip, the sharp, refreshing taste ran down my throat. For a while, we sat together in comfortable silence, enjoying the sake and some pickled snacks we had bought at a souvenir shop. Though we didn't talk much, the atmosphere felt peaceful and pleasant. "Hey, Steve, why did you leave your previous job?" "It was a trading company, right?" "You're so good at your job," Hannah asked, her face slightly flushed, possibly from the alcohol. I was feeling a bit tipsy too, and for the first time, I felt like sharing a story I usually kept to myself. Maybe it was because it was Hannah asking. My older brother had already joined the company before me. We were really close. So I thought it would be great to help him out by working at the same place. But, well, I ended up being better at the job than him. The CEO took a liking to me, and my brother didn't handle it well. He started using his position as my superior to make my life difficult, giving me extra work, blaming me for his mistakes. I figured he'd get over it eventually, and things would go back to normal. So I didn't let the others know what was happening. I think to them, I seemed to be doing just fine. But in the end, it got to me. On the day of a major business meeting, I came down with a fever. My brother told the CEO I was being irresponsible, and that was the end of it. I was forced to resign. The sip of alcohol I took now tasted bitter, unlike before. Since I left the company, I haven't seen my brother. I'm too scared to face him. Even someone who looks like they have it all together may be carrying their own scars. That's something I've learned from all this. And this is the first time I've ever told anyone about it. Hannah looked at me with sadness in her eyes. From the collar of her gown, I could see a small part of her scar peeking through. She gently placed her hand over it. "Since you shared your secret with me, I guess I should tell you mine. You don't have to, you know." But Hannah shook her head. Her expression became resolute as she looked straight at me. It seemed the alcohol's effects had completely worn off. "This scar, you see, was from an accident. A car accident. My parents, they loved traveling. They loved it so much that they even started a company like this. When I was little, I often traveled with them, riding in my dad's car, going to all sorts of places. When I was 12, we were headed on a trip to the hot springs, the three of us together in the car. But on the way, a truck driver who had fallen asleep at the wheel crashed into us, and my mom." Hannah clenched her hand over the scar, her head bowed. Even from where I was sitting, I could see her small frame trembling. The accident hadn't just left a physical scar on her body, it had left a deep wound on her heart. I realized then why she had looked so pale in the car earlier. She had wanted to hold my hand because she needed reassurance. Ever since then, I'd been terrified of traveling. I had originally planned to find a job somewhere else, but nothing worked out.
So, in the end, my dad hired me at his company. He made sure I could stay in an office role, away from the travel side of things. He's overprotective like that. And I get why the other employees resent me. You've heard them, haven't you? I nodded slightly, and Hannah gave a self-deprecating laugh. I'm the daughter of a travel company founder, but I'm too scared to travel. I got this cushy position because of my dad's connections. And I don't do any field work. I've always known I couldn't keep going like this, but I couldn't take that first step. Then you saved me. When I collapsed that day, it was because the memories of the accident came flooding back. I was shocked when you saw my scar. And I said horrible things to you in my panic. But you forgave me. You didn't ask about the scar. And you stood up for me when others spoke behind my back. With you, I feel like I can finally take that first step. I thought, maybe, if I faltered, you'd gently take my hand and walk with me. That's why I took on this job and chose you as my partner. I was terrified to come here, but I made it. I took that first step, thanks to you being by my side. Hannah's words filled me with a sense of warmth and excitement. But then, I noticed Hannah's downcast expression, and the excitement I had felt moments before quickly faded. This scar. I'd shown it to others before. Especially to men. And when they see it, they start treating me like I'm fragile or damaged. Even if they'd shown interest in me before, they act differently once they know. But you were different. You're the first guy who's ever treated me kindly, even after seeing it. Hannah looked at me with searching eyes. Her cheeks still flushed despite having sobered up. Noticing the blush, my heart began to race again. But it's just your nature, right? You're kind to everyone, so it's not like I'm special to you. Tears began to spill from her eyes. I held my breath. Slowly, I moved closer to her. She didn't push me away, didn't show any sign of resistance as I sat beside her. Her hands were tightly clasped in her lap, so I gently placed my hand over hers. Hannah looked up, startled, as I brushed a kiss against her tear-streaked cheek. I kissed her to scoop away the tears running down her cheeks. That's not true. To me, Hannah, you are special. I want to treat you kindly because you're important to me, and I want to cherish you. As if a dam had broken, tears poured from her eyes. I softly guided her head to rest against my chest, stroking her hair gently. Then, she grabbed onto my pajamas as if clinging to me, and cried like a child. We left the inn just before noon the next day. I thanked the landlady who said, "Please drive safely on your way home," then got into the car and headed back. Hannah, just like on the way there, lightly held onto the hem of my shirt. But this time, it didn't feel like it was out of anxiety. Her expression was much softer now. The silence that filled the car wasn't awkward or uncomfortable. It was peaceful. As I focused on driving carefully, Hannah suddenly spoke. That inn, it was where we were supposed to go when my mom passed away. Ha! I almost turned to look at her, but quickly stopped myself. I could hear her chuckle softly beside me. That's why I didn't want to remember the trip. It's filled with painful memories. But thanks to you, I was able to replace those memories with good ones. Really, thank you. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye and saw her smiling, her cheeks flushed with warmth. Suppressing the urge to reach out and hug her, I smiled back. No, thank you. I had a great time. On Tuesday, after taking Monday off as a day in lieu, I returned to work. The moment I entered the office, my senior colleagues crowded around me. "Hey, how was the trip with Hannah? Got any pictures? Come on, show us."
I laughed awkwardly, trying to fend off their questions, when Hannah called out to me.
"Steve, can you come here for a second?"
Relieved to escape the grilling from my seniors, I followed her.
Hannah chuckled softly. "Tough morning, huh? Who do you think is responsible for that?" "So, what's up?" "I'm about to go see my dad and report on the inspection." "But I'm a little nervous." "Could you come with me?" Hannah gently took my hand. I nodded without hesitation. When we entered Mr. Adams's office together, he raised an eyebrow in slight surprise. But his expression quickly softened as he looked at Hannah, concern clouding his eyes. "Hannah, I heard you went on a site inspection for the tour plan recently. Are you all right? Here's the report," Hannah said in a firm voice, handing him the summary we had prepared. Mr. Adams leafed through the papers briefly. "Dad, I made it. I went on the trip, and I'll be fine doing more field work from now on. You don't have to worry about me anymore." When Mr. Adams looked up, his eyes were glistening. He stood up from his chair and immediately pulled Hannah into a tight embrace. "I see. You did well, Hannah. I was overprotective, not realizing that you were growing and trying to move forward." "I'm sorry." Hannah shook her head in response. After letting her go, Mr. Adams approached me and grasped my hand firmly. "It was thanks to you, Steve, that Hannah was able to overcome her trauma. You saved her life, and no matter how much I thank you, it won't be enough. Truly, thank you. No, it's because of her own strength that she's been able to move forward. You're such a good person. I can trust you with Hannah. Maybe one day, you could even take over this company." "Oh, Dad. You're getting way ahead of yourself." Flustered, Hannah blushed deeply at Mr. Adams's sudden comment, and with her cheeks puffed out, she playfully hit him. The room filled with bright laughter. As I soaked in the happiness of the moment, I resolved that I, too, needed to take a step forward. That Saturday, I went to visit my brother alone. He lives by himself in an apartment near his old company. But it had a security system, and no one answered when I buzzed the number I remembered. As I stood there confused, a resident approached, so I stepped aside to let them pass. "Excuse me, do you know if someone named Keller used to live in Unit 606? I decided to ask while I had the chance. To my surprise, I was told the apartment was now vacant. He moved out about a month ago. I'm not sure where he went, though." After thanking the resident, I called my parents. As expected, my brother was staying with them. I hurriedly drove to our family home. It was about a 30-minute drive if I took the highway. After greeting my parents briefly, I stood outside my brother's tightly closed room. They say the president found out he'd been blaming his mistakes on his subordinates, and in a fit of anger, forced him to resign. He hasn't come out since. I gently asked my worried mother to step back and call it out, "Keller." There was no response, but I could sense he was there. "Keller, I'm working at a place called Moonlight Travel Agency now." As the name suggests, it's a travel company. And my experience from my previous job has been really helpful. Plus, I met a woman there who I want to cherish for the rest of my life. Things are going really well for me right now. Silence followed. But I continued speaking. "What you did to me hurt me deeply. But I want to move forward, which is why I came here. If you feel any regret for what you did, Please open this door. Let's talk, so we can both move on. Again, there was no reply. I waited patiently for my brother to open the door.
Then, I heard a soft rustling sound inside, and slowly, the door opened. Keller, looking completely exhausted, appeared. Our eyes met, his face gaunt and worn. In that instant, he collapsed to his knees.
"Steve, I'm so sorry.
I let my jealousy toward how the president favored you get the better of me, and I treated you terribly.
Everyone around me kept comparing us, saying you were the better one, and I couldn't handle it. It started as small acts of resentment, but it escalated. Yet, you never told anyone, not even after you left the company."
I don't expect to be forgiven, but if it helps you,
I'll apologize as many times as I need to. Please, talk to me. I know I've been a terrible brother, but I still want to be your brother. Like before. Hearing Keller's tearful confession, my heart tightened. Keller, that's enough apologizing. So let's talk a lot, like we used to.
He looked up, nodded, and wiped his tears, then invited me into his room.
6 months have passed since then.
Now, I'm driving with Hannah in the passenger seat, carefully navigating the road.
By the way, Keller just got a new job. Really? That's wonderful.
Hannah was genuinely happy for me, as if it were her own achievement.
That made me really happy.
"Oh, we're here." Just as she said, the inn we were looking for came into view ahead of us. The spacious parking lot made it easy to park, and I had no trouble getting the car in place. We were here again for another site inspection of a tour plan. This one, like before, was for couples. By now, it had become the norm for Hannah and me to handle all the couple-oriented tour inspections together. Since the release of the Spring Rain-Ins tour plan, our company's reputation had soared, with clients saying,
"Moonlight Travel Agency really has the best plans." As a result, we've been getting requests for consultation from inns all over.
Thanks to this, what was once a small company had grown so much that Mr. Adams was seriously considering going public. As we got out of the car, the scent of the sea filled the air. This inn was built right by the ocean, its main selling point. It even had a private beach. Hannah stretched out her arms with a satisfied smile. Then, in a playful move, she wrapped her arm around mine.
"Let's drop off our bags and head straight to the private beach. And of course, we'll be wearing swimsuits. Hannah, we're here for work, remember? Don't get too carried away." I know.
Seeing her genuinely enjoying herself, a smile naturally spread across my face.
Everyone carries unseen scars, hidden beneath the surface.
Those scars vary from person to person, and that's why you should never dismiss them or belittle someone's pain. You accept the person, scars, and all. And in doing so, healing can begin. Just like how Hannah had managed to overcome her trauma, she could now travel freely and even bare her skin in front of others. Something she once found impossible.